And a very good morning to you. It's 4 minutes after 10. Do you... I don't suppose you do, actually. You're probably far too busy getting on with leading a normal life. But sometimes I have this habit, if you like, of seeing stories knitting into one another, merging into one another. And there are a few stories around today that I think speak to the same phenomenon. We begin with news from the Education Secretary yesterday, Bridget Phillipson, revealing that children are going to be taught how to spot extremist content online in a revamp of the curriculum. So she wants to arm, or she wants teachers to arm pupils against what she calls putrid conspiracy theories. And this will happen in English, ICT and maths. But when you're talking about putrid conspiracy theories, the idea that the UK has a two-tier approach to policing in favour, if you like, of minorities and somehow discriminating against the white majority is dealt a fairly hefty blow by another report this morning that shows the Royal United Services Institute concluding that Islamist violence is treated far more harshly than that of the far right. And of course, I would remind you, another story, that it is only 2023, hardly the mists of time, when Baroness Louise Casey's review into the Metropolitan Police, commissioned, of course, in the wake of Sarah Everard's murder, found the Metropolitan Police to be racist, misogynistic and homophobic. So how on earth have so many people on social media ended up believing that these institutions, that this service somehow discriminates in favour of people who would historically be victims of racism, misogyny and homophobia? And then the penultimate story that I'd throw into this mix is on the front page of the Times today. And as calls grow for some sort of restrictions to be placed upon the level of lies and misinformation that can be disseminated on social media, most obviously X, where all the checks and balances, all the defences against extremism and lies have been removed by Elon Musk. The Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism reports that X is now the top platform for hosting... Now wait, just pause there. It shouldn't matter what I say next. It shouldn't matter what I say next. If I were to say it's the top platform for posting far-right hate videos, your reaction should be exactly the same to what it will be when I tell you that it's now the top platform for hosting Hamas videos. And then the final story that I would add into this mix this morning is, well, fairly straightforward. Donald Trump has issued a blatant lie about Kamala Harris's crowd at a recent appearance she made at an airport, and compounded it with, on his Truth Social platform, a platform he set up entirely so that he could avoid the rules and regulations of the last pre-Musk incarnation of Twitter or social media. He has compounded lie after lie after lie, making all manner of claims that are demonstrably and irrefutably untrue. So it's all very well teaching children to look out for fake news. Who the heck is going to help their parents? We find ourselves in extremely weird waters. And there's another point that I'd make here. There's another point that I think I alluded to on Friday. We're living in parallel universes at the moment. If you spend no time at all on social media, then you will not be aware of much of the madness that is currently unfolding in the realms of so-called two-tier policing, or indeed Elon Musk's attempts to undermine the British government by disseminating and amplifying some arrant nonsense and some profoundly unpleasant individuals and ideas. So I found myself wondering, as I tried to pick over the bones of all of this yesterday, I found myself wondering whether it has some role to play, or whether it may have some role to play in the pitifully low turnout at the last general election. I'm at one end of the extreme. I live on an almost undiluted diet of news, and I spend more time than is probably healthy on social media. And and therefore I'm bombarded with information from all angles, and I've got a fairly good radar or fairly reliable antennae for knowing what is true and what is obviously not true. But it also exposes me to a large number of people who willfully, I think, believe things that are not true, and sometimes have been simply bamboozled by the volume of stuff that they've been bombarded with that I can see from my eyrie, from my perspective, is not true. But what if you're not fully engaged? Or what if you're at the other end of the extreme and you believe all the nonsense that is being put out by Tommy Ten Names or various other agitators, and none of the stuff that is being done by responsible journalists or responsible news organisations? And what if you've just given up completely? What if you thought, well, I just don't know what's true anymore? Which is why I think that many of these roads lead back to Kellyanne Conway and her insistence that alternative facts deserve at least as much space and attention, and indeed credibility, as actual facts. How much of what we're looking at now, in other words, can be traced back to the fact that we, I use that word loosely to describe the media or the establishment or traditional institutions, we still treat Donald Trump as if he is a sane actor. We still interview people. We've got Conservative MPs saying that they would still vote for him, despite the fact that he has completely normalised abject lies. He's completely normalised demonstrable untruths and sought to pass them off as facts, as the truth. And millions and millions and millions of people apparently believe him. There's a conversation to be had another day about whether or not people do genuinely believe what he tells them, or whether there is something else psychologically going on. But as a lot of attention is turned to social media, and you don't have to be on it to be helpful to me this morning. In many ways, if you're never on it at all, your answer to some of the questions, your answers plural to some of the questions that I am about to ask, will be at least as interesting as the answers of those of us who are immersed in the medium. What shouldn't be allowed on there? Bearing in mind there are some live criminal cases unfolding about which we won't be able to talk for legal reasons. But if children are to be taught how to spot fake news, how confident are we that we would know what to put on that curriculum? So question number one, and I want you to come at this from whatever angle you want. You can allude back to things I've already said, or you can come with something completely novel and original. How have we ended up in a place, because it can't all be on Donald Trump, can it? How have we ended up in a place where facts and lies are almost seen as two sides of the same coin? How have we ended up in a place where the Secretary of State for Education genuinely believes that children need to be taught how to spot fake news? So if we see that as the end point, the Secretary of State for Education believes that children need to be taught how to spot fake news. You go back 10 years, we wouldn't even have known what that phrase meant or what that idea involved or why this policy was necessary. What has happened on both sides of the Atlantic, and of course beyond, what has happened in the last 10 years that has created an environment in which children will need to be taught what fake news is, and more importantly, how to stop it. So who do you blame? You can blame individuals, you can blame institutions, you can blame... Whose fault is it that fake news has taken such a hold on our population that the Secretary of State for Education believes that children are going to need to be taught how to spot it? I remember the first time someone told me that in Estonia this already happens. And the reason why it happens in Estonia, and I think some other countries that border Russia, is, I've just given you a bit of a clue as to why it happens in those countries, is because they are in danger of being subsumed by fake news, lies and propaganda that are pumped out by the Kremlin. But geography is irrelevant. when you think about it, especially in the digital age. Just because these countries are on the border of Russia or very near to Russia doesn't mean that they are somehow more susceptible to fake news and propaganda. The nature of the internet, the nature of the modern world is such that you could be thousands and thousands and thousands of miles away and just as vulnerable to the same movement. So I don't know. I don't know how anybody can answer the question of how much of this goes back to Russia. But we can certainly begin, as we look at Britain, we can begin to put together an answer to the question of why do children need to be taught how to spot fake news. And then the second point is, what will we put in this curriculum? Now, I like this question for two reasons. Number one, it means that we don't have to pile immediately into territory that we've explored quite a lot before, which is about regulation of the internet. We may get onto that a little later. But what would we put on the how would you teach a child how to spot fake news? And maybe, if there's time, when your child does what all children do, and they turn around and say, but why is this out there, Mummy? Why are they allowed to do this? Why is YouTube or Facebook or Twitter, why are they allowed to put this stuff out? How do we answer that question? So I think there are three ways into this. The first is, how did we end up in a place? Who has led us to a place where our children need to be taught how to spot fake news? Number two, the second question, very much allied to the first question, what are we going to put in that curriculum? Your job is to give me a lesson plan for the class in which children will be taught how to spot fake news. How are we going to do it? 0345 6060 973. And then the third question, which I guess you come at after you've answered the first question and the second question, the third question becomes, why are they allowed to do it? That's what every child will say. You can give them the best lesson plan in the world, and at the end of it, they'll say, but why, Dad, why? And I don't actually know. 0345 6060 973 is the number that you need. So how are we going to do this? If you hit the numbers now, you will get through. You can text me on 84850. You can WhatsApp me on 0345 6060 973. But I do prefer to hear your voice in my ears, and I can only do that if you dial 0345 6060 973. And speaking of voices, a few of you have picked up on a slight change in my normal sound in your ears this morning, which is because I am in a different studio from usual. So do not worry. I haven't got some terrible cold or I haven't been locked in a fridge, as one person has suggested. Normal service is in place. 10:16 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Your answers to these questions after this. 18 minutes after 10 is the time. Thank you. People seem to enjoy my attempt to knit the stories together today. Let me run you through the headlines again, all of which I think contribute to the questions we're asking. Trump falsely claims Harris used AI to doctor size of crowd. X faces axe from Tech's anti-terror initiative. Islamist violence treated more harshly than that of far right. And children or pupils to get lessons on fake news. Jacques is in Clapham to kick things off. Jacques, what would you like to say?
Hi, yeah. So I guess my point with regards to the algorithm, would be the algorithm and the way that social media companies, who in my opinion are one of the main people for blame, in the way they've formed that, has created a system that sort of incentivizes people to put out sort of eye-catching news and thumbnails on YouTube and headlines. And one of the things I've noticed, especially in the last couple of years, is with the more sort of people have been trying to chase the headlines, people haven't been reading what's in the articles themselves. And so, I had a lot of people, I mean, I've done it myself, where I've seen a headline, I've just sort of blurted it out and not actually read what's below. And then suddenly that becomes fact. And then, you've got someone saying... I don't think
that's a deliberately manipulative process, the second bit of what you say. I think the algorithm is clearly manipulative, but I've had clips of my own show put out under headlines that I wasn't sure actually reflected accurately what was going to happen in the clip. And in fact, there was a piece in The Independent not long ago about something I said about private education, and the article was completely at odds with what people took away from the headline. I don't know that that's deliberately manipulative, but the idea that if I show an interest in crimes being committed by people with a certain ethnicity, then if I'm on the For You bit of X rather than the following bit of X, then the algorithm is going to bombard me with clips from the last 20 years in every corner of the world, focusing exclusively on crime being committed by people with darker skin than me. And that, I guess, is part of the problem you describe.
Yeah, and I've seen it a fair amount on, they're on things like YouTube and things. I mean, bear in mind, this is anecdotal. I don't want to be saying this, this
Sure.
is across the board. But, people have been trying to do studies about whether or not social media in general will push you towards the right wing. It is a bit harder, but you do have to have the initial, right wing or that sort of opinion. I don't want to say right wing, but you want to have that.
No, I don't know about that. You mean you've got to have a seed that can be watered? I'm not so sure. I think if you came at it from year zero, you came at it from a position of complete impartiality, then decent people can have their head turned very far to the right by some of the stuff that is going to... And the problem is that we talk about social media in pejorative terms, but an awful lot of this stuff, of course, has found a home in legacy media as well. The Daily Mail, the Murdoch Press, the Telegraph, all of those places have done it. The question then becomes, and I know you may not have rung in to answer this one, but there are 3 questions on the board today, Jacques. What are you going to put in your lesson plan for these children?
Oh, God. Oh, that's a hell of a question. I mean, my dad's been a headmaster for years, and
oh, wow.
He's sort of tried to sort of handle it, I guess, as best as it can as it's come through.
Yeah.
But I guess you'd sort of, I don't know. I mean, in my opinion, it would come down to limiting what their access is. I had a lot of friends who were sort of given lots of different kinds of phones the second they turned a certain age, whereas my brother and I were given, sort of flip phone. And I know,
right?
That's
so
pretty difficult.
You're a canary down the coal, and yeah, but was that because your dad saw what was happening at school? He'd had a little bit more exposure to further down the road of childhood than most parents would have, because they only have the children they've got. They don't have access. They don't deal daily with loads of other children. You're not answering the question though, because you're not teaching children how to deal with fake news. You're coming up with ideas on how they might avoid it.
I guess the best one, it sounds odd to say, would just be pick a bunch of certified examples. And I know saying certified examples is actually kind of a, difficult term because you can't certify them, I guess. But
who certifies the certifier?
If there are some that are widely agreed by both sort of political sides that can be called fake news, I guess you could pick out.
Well, then you've got Kellyanne Conway. You've got Kellyanne Conway popping up, and all of Donald Trump's movement, and all of his supporters on both sides of the Atlantic who remain on side, who have fully bought into the idea that black is white, that up is down, that alternative facts are somehow a counter to fact. Thank you, Jacques. Perfect start. Old colleague of mine, old friend of mine, Dorothy, who was the education correspondent on a newspaper that we worked together, tells me that schools are doing this already. My daughter was taught how to spot fake news back in her state primary school over 5 years ago, and where to check to ensure that what they were reading and seeing was true. As a result, she's now careful and discerning, if not cynical. Problem is, of course, if you were to suggest that you use LBC or the BBC to check on what is and what is not true, it's not just weirdos on the internet that are popping up to poo-poo that. People like Jacob Rees-Mogg have dedicated huge amounts of energy to attacking the BBC. Farage is always at it. He's never off it, and he never stops attacking it. So how do you persuade children which outlets are trustworthy and which outlets are not? This is a really good question, isn't it? The lesson plan, which popped into my head halfway through the introduction. The lesson plan might prove to be the best of those 3 questions. Jack, thank you. Kay's in Winches. Kay, what would you like to say?
Yes, I want to talk about the lesson plan, but what you just read out makes it even more difficult. But the truth is you've got to do it gradually. You've got to start early, like in that girls' school. And you start with the why questions, the whole Socratic method or whatever. But you come up, for example, I could imagine, I've taught a little bit in primary schools as well as older children, and you come up with a conclusion of an argument, like we should have longer playtime, something that's relevant to them. You get them to brainstorm reasons why we should have longer playtimes and reasons why we shouldn't, and then get them assessing those reasons. So you're first... Forget about evidence. You're first just looking at what's a good reason for an argument, because that's the building block, and then you can.
So critical thinking. You're talking about critical thinking, which is a bit of a it's a bit of a magic wand whenever we have conversations like this. I wave it myself, Kay. I wave it very happily myself. And the problem is that some people will say, I don't want to malign everybody that's ever used this phrase, but generally speaking, when somebody tells me that they do their own research, whether you're talking about COVID vaccines, Vladimir Putin, or two-tier policing, when people tell me that they do their own research, they think they are critically thinking.
They do, but there's critical thinking, and it's just the same as if you look up your own medical symptoms on Google. There's good places to go and less good places to go. And we have to sort of embed why that's so. I mean, I taught A-level critical thinking and AS for about 8 years.
Is that a self-contained subject, or is that part of another subject?
It used to be until Gove came along, and then it wasn't possible.
This can't be something else that we lay at Michael Gove's doorstep.
No, it really is, because
I had no idea.
If you remember that he insisted that there had to be a higher knowledge content in A-levels, and of course critical thinking, yes, you can learn the names of certain flaws and how to spot them, and you can learn
but not joining the dots,
it wasn't
as it were.
enough. It was all about applying those skills to text and so on. So I'm afraid it died, which is a shame, because I found that I think the students would back this up. Everybody that I taught gained something from it,
Yes.
And I found that sometimes even the brainiest students who were doing it as an extra because they were going on to Oxbridge or a Russell group, they didn't necessarily have that critical faculty. They tended to believe what was in front of them. So presenting them with a Daily Mail article or with something you'd heard on the way to work from some politician on the Today programme or whatever.
Yes.
I didn't listen to LBC then. Was a real eye-opener. And it's all very well teaching it. I heard that you said they were going to teach it in maths, ICT and English. Well, a lot of kids really hate maths and aren't going to be receptive to applying it, But also it tends to be taught without that. I don't know. It needs to be.
I don't know what the plan is. I don't know what the plan is. Thank you, Kay. But maths is quite a good place to start, because 2 + 2 = 4 is a fact. In Kellyanne Conway's world and Donald Trump's world, 2 + 2 = 5 is an equally valid conclusion to arrive at. So maths might be the starting point, but I grant you that a lot of kids don't like it. And Bridget Phillipson, the Education Secretary, used the phrase yesterday. That's why our curriculum review will develop plans to embed critical skills in lessons to arm our children against the disinformation, fake news and putrid conspiracy theories awash on social media. But what if their mums and dads think that you can trust Tommy Ten Names or Farage? How are you going to help them come to a better understanding of reality and truth? Jamie's in Croydon. Jamie, what would you like to say?
Yeah, thank you. I really was just thinking about that critical thinking. Kids at school have to be taught about critical thinking. But I think part of it as well is, and you just mentioned it there, we're talking about facts and opinions, and they're two different things. Right.
Yes.
So if we're talking about how we help kids spot misinformation on social media, I think we start with maybe what is a fact and what is an opinion.
That's why maths is a good place to start, really. It's not an opinion,
exactly.
It's counting.
Exactly, yeah. But then you also mentioned it just then as well, that, my point here is that a lot of what kids pick up, yes, it's in school, but a lot of it is also at home. And
yes,
I think we can tackle this through educating children, but who's educating the parents? Right, and that's my concern here. And to be honest, part of this problem, I think, is just the way that we conduct ourselves in government. I say we, I don't mean me. But, you look at the Boris bus is a great example. Stuff like that where, is it fact, is it opinion? Stuff gets thrown around and people start to regurgitate it with not checking it themselves. That, I think, is a real part of the issue here, and I don't know how you tackle that. But
I don't know if you've heard. There's a chap called Alex Tate he set up an organisation called Reform Political Advertising. They're doing really great work, actually, and he points out repeatedly that the regulation of adverts for washing powder is considerably more stringent than the regulation of adverts for political parties and political promises, and he would wholeheartedly agree with you, and I think he's very much on the side of the angels. And oddly, actually, I did an event recently for some of the sort of big marketing head honchos in the country, and he was one of the speakers there, so he's making enormous inroads into that world. But yeah, I mean, you're going to teach children critical thinking, and that bus that Boris Johnson drove around Britain during the referendum campaign is all perfectly permissible. You could well be on a hiding to nothing. Jamie, thank you. The time is 10:30. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. 3 questions. I think my favourite is the second one. How have we ended up in a place where children need to be taught how to spot fake news? Number 2, what would you put in the actual lesson plan? And just to test whether you're paying attention or not, you can remember what the third question was. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It's 33 minutes after 10. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. We'll have a look in the next hour at this question of whether or not the UK has lost respect for police. And as ever on this programme, we'll do the why of it. If it's true, I wonder how much of it has to do with people now wringing their hands about the fact that the police seem to be treated quite contemptuously by swathes, not necessarily huge swathes of the population, exactly the same people that have spent much of the last 20 years telling us that the police can't be trusted because they occasionally dance with a reveller at the Notting Hill Carnival, or wear a helmet adorned with the pride flag, or seek to undo or at least push back decades of established institutional racism by involving themselves in diversity initiatives or taking the knee during the Black Lives Matter protest. Yes, it's funny, isn't it? Imagine punting all of that poison for the last 20 years and then waking up this morning and wondering, why do you think people have lost respect for the people I've spent 20 years telling you can't be trusted or are opposed to your interests? So just don't look at the evidence, listen to my rhetoric. And that perhaps plays into the conversation we're having this hour, which is about fake news, critical thinking, children, and curricula. Tallulah is in Mousehole in Cornwall. Tallulah, what would you like to say?
Oh, hello. It's Talia, but
it's Talia.
yeah.
I do apologise.
Yeah.
I'm in an unfamiliar studio today, and that bit of the screen is much further away than usual. But you are. You see, I was congratulating myself then for pronouncing Mousehole correctly, because not everybody would have done. Some people would have said you were in Mousehole. But anyway, never mind. Talia, what would you like to say?
Well, I completely agree. When I saw all the things going online and everything kicking off in this country, I'm a local councillor, and as I see all the time, everything on the online world, the people that write things with impunity to me and think that they speak for everybody, they're only the shouty minority. So you knew that there would be lots of people coming out who are just sensible, good people that have got balance and they understand. But unfortunately, when you've got cowboy territory and when people like, Richard Dawkins' Facebook is removed offline or whatever, you get to that point of, I've been looking at facts for
I'm not across that story. What was it? Was his Facebook removed for reasons?
Yes, and I think it was for talking facts, nothing other than facts. And
right.
I think you get to this point of, I follow lots of people, and I'm
not across that story. How does that help children understand what fake news is? Referring to that story.
So what I find is, or when I saw all those riots, I thought the first thing I really want to do when it comes to September is to try and get back into schools to talk about critical thinking. Now, because I'm part of a party, some schools are really nervous. You can go in and say to your blue in the face, I will talk absolutely apolitically about the importance that children learn, because they look at memes, they follow somebody, they're like, but those, they don't, I don't think so, understand so much about the factual bit behind. And of course, as politicians, in any party, it's just that headline that's important. And I have tried in everything I've ever done to go behind that headline, to never put a story up that will just get me lots of clicks or likes. I try and put the facts up. It won't get me one, but it will get me, my integrity stays intact. But even when I remember Trump, when the thing happened in America, there was a journalist on LBC who said, "Oh, well, of course we'll make political capital out of that." And I remember thinking, but we shouldn't that's wrong, because this is dangerous.
No, that's analysis. That's analysis. If you ban analysis of events, then I'm out of a job, Nick's out of a job, everyone on LBC's out of a job, every newspaper columnist in the world is out of a job, and anybody. But no, but that's perhaps I've misunderstood your example. But of course, not only was it valid analysis to say Donald Trump will benefit politically from the assassination attempt, brutal though that sounds, he did.
Yes, I think what I mean is that politicians...
Again, I don't understand why that example helps children understand what fake news is. Respectfully, Talia.
Okay, so I suppose what it is politicians, I think we all have a part to play here. And when the rhetoric is so... When we know that we can make political...
No, I know all that, but just that example, the Trump example, how is that relevant to teaching children how to spot fake news?
Because I think politicians, we should all be better. I think Trump thinking, and people expecting, everyone expecting that a politician is going to make I'm trying to think of another example, like Gaza with the Labour Party, and perhaps not saying how it would stand because it was worried about anti-Semitism. We should be talking about those things where perhaps the Tories will not, or the other parties will not jump on that, but we'll try and do what's best. Okay. We'll try and dial down things. And I think, I've always thought politicians need to be better. We need to be about people overall, not...
Yeah, helping children understand what fake news is and encouraging politicians to be better, they're two very, very different things. You can certainly be in favour of both, and maybe the job of helping children spot what fake news is, as I suggested from the start this morning, is going to be rendered much harder when you've got people like Donald Trump and indeed some UK commentators and politicians spreading things that are demonstrably and irrefutably untrue. But we're trying to work out how we teach the children to spot it. So an answer to that question can't be, well, let's make sure that the politicians don't do it. It's just slightly different angles, I suppose. Thank you, Talia. Miles is in Reading. Miles, what would you like to say?
Hey, James, how's it going?
All good. What's on your mind?
Awesome. So I actually taught a curriculum on this, and I looked up the date when you started talking about it, and it was in 2018. So it's kind of sad that it hasn't become fuller in the curriculum these days.
You're my mate, Miles.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you introduced me. Well, you were more, when we first met about 1 million years ago, you were more into trying to help make the internet a nicer place, weren't you? Trying to sort of use it as a force for good, which, in many ways you were ahead of your time. But yeah, you're right to reflect upon the fact that if anyone who's had their shoulder to this particular wheel in recent years has not secured what you might call glorious success.
Yeah, I think that's a polite way of doing it, and I appreciate that. So in terms of the curriculum, it was set up by YouTube, and it was a sort of a test run that was done, and we would tour schools across the UK, teaching kids around the age of 14, 15. Yeah. And the first module we did was about how to spot fake news. It was like looking at headlines, has a website got like a secure HTTPS, all these kind of things. But the part I wanted to talk about in this conversation were the next two modules, because I think these are where it gets a bit more interesting with context. So the second module was about emotional manipulation. And so what we would do is we would show like a charity advert for like an animal charity, and it would be some dog, sad, raining, music. And we would say like, what is this trying to make you feel? And the kids were like, oh, it's trying to make us feel sorry for the dog and that. And the reason we brought that up was the charity and what they were representing was actually true, but they were also trying to emotionally get under your skin. And that is like a nuanced perspective that I think when it comes to critical thinking, we often think, oh, if something is trying to emotionally manipulate us in the way it's edited, it must be fake. But the reality is something can be fake and not emotionally manipulative. And on the flip side, something can be emotionally manipulative and also true. Giving them the powers to make that distinction, almost by a form of intellectual osmosis, helps them spot the stuff that's fake, because they'll think, oh yes, this one is manipulating me emotionally, but that doesn't mean it's not true. Yeah, that's exactly it. And I came to this. It was the first time I'd ever taught in schools, and it was a real eye-opening experience of the difference you can make in just a day. And I always approached it with a lot of empathy, because when you and I were at school, I mean, I can only speak to myself, but I was bullied. And when I left the school gates, I left the bullies there. When kids are bullies these days, they take that home with them because of WhatsApp and social media. And so they're completely drowning in information. And so the third module we taught, and it's a little bit of a story, but it's a really, really good one. It was called Mission to Mars. And so what we would do is we would nominate 1s and 2s across the class and split them into 2 sections. And we'd have one leader with each of them. And we would say, we've had it signed off with your parents. After school, whoever wins this is going to Mars. And like they know we're playing along, but they're very excited by the idea. And we give each of them a list of skills. One of them was like more specific and one was like more abstract, like creativity and things like that. And we would give them 10 minutes to come up with their argument of why they should be the ones to go to Mars. And we also gave each of them megaphones. And at the end of the 10 minutes, and the leaders would keep going, oh, our team's better than your team, and we'd really be riling them up. And then when we then go to the class, we let each of them, just basically at either side of the class, have a go at each other. And it got really, really heated. And we had to warn the teachers, like, if anyone had to step in, and some got quite, uptight about it.
Really?
And then we would say, oh, who has the counter argument? And it would build up more and more. And eventually you could see they were really uptight. And then we would say, right, everyone sit down. No one's going to Mars. But how are you feeling? And kids would be like, I feel so angry right now. Like, I really wanted to go and stuff. And so we would then say, well, this is about something. You knew we weren't going to Mars. And how angry did you feel when you were pitted against each other? Now, imagine it was associated with something that was more intrinsic to you, like your religion or your ethnic identity and stuff.
Yes.
And the transformation, you had kids coming out. Like, I just remember there was one kid who was like this really big guy, really quiet, and he seemed like he didn't really open up a lot. And then his mates would just say, hey, just want to say we really appreciate you and stuff. And the stuff you saw into that moment just blew my mind. And it
so you've gone back to source on. So you're not really answering the question of how do you teach them how to spot fake news. You're almost trying to provide them with personality tweaks that improve them as citizens, and then also equip them with faculties that would be helpful in spotting. You're teaching people how they can be manipulated, and that's brilliant, because I hadn't thought of that as being the starting point for teaching them about what is fake and what is not. Why did it stop? Was it government funding? Why do you not do it anymore? Is it Mike?
So it did get brought up in Parliament, and I think it is just a matter of priorities. I don't know, but it did get like accreditation. At each of the schools, we'd get the local MP to come in, and a story for another time. One of those was Liz Truss. I had an interesting conversation with her, and I saw her get pitted up against kids asking about why there's not more funding, and she says, I believe you should have more tax, less tax and more money in your pockets, and they were not impressed.
Fantastic.
Which was
It's an early indicator of where her career was heading. Here's an interesting thing that you've just made me think of, and typically I can't actually find the story that it refers to, but I did see it this morning. I thought I'd cut it out of the newspapers, but I haven't. If I sit here now, Miles, and bang on about how social media needs to be better regulated, the internet needs to be better regulated, we need to put fake news on, and sadly a growing constituency of people have been persuaded that is somehow an affront to their free speech, that you should be free to post lies, you should be free to misrepresent reality. A complete fundamental misunderstanding, whether you're coming at it from the point of the American Constitution or George Orwell, who's having one of those moments in the sun. There's a story in the news at the moment about the proliferation of online videos of animal cruelty. So the RSPCA is warning that the internet is increasingly awash with people who have filmed themselves abusing animals, being cruel to animals. And if you used that for the British public, I don't know if this is true in other countries, but if you use that for the British public as a lever to make them understand the dangers of social media, that would be more effective than some of the stories that we have about memes or about extremism or about man's inhumanity to man. Bring the animals into it and you get a different emotional hit, which is kind of where you started this conversation.
Yeah. That's very true. I guess the final point I would make to that, actually, and this is going to sound like a cliche, was naturally doing this with YouTube. We had a lot of people online going, oh, YouTube are telling you what to think. And like, we were apolitical. We had people of all political persuasions. But this is the cliche, and it's a cliche because it's true. It's about teaching people not what to think, but how to think, because then people discover basically better truths on their own. Because the reality is, we are all drowning in information online, and the idea of regulation, I think there is some argument for regulation, when it comes to defamation and things like that. But the only way you're going to win this war is by building better critical thinking and making people better prepared, because people are going to be finding this out on their own.
Yeah, mate, what a great call. It's lovely to hear your voice as well. It's been too long. And almost to prove your point while you're talking, someone called Paul says, oh, great, so Miles is inoculating children. He's literally teaching them how to spot right from wrong, mate, how to spot false from true, how to spot manipulation from objective. But if that reaches you as inoculation, then all of his points are proved. And I'm going to try to be clever now, and it will almost certainly backfire, and I'm already late for the junction. So if I had said then, when Miles was talking about drowning in information and misinformation and lacking the faculties to tell the difference, I could have said to you, that is like King Canute trying to hold back the tides. You know, there is no earthly way that King Canute was ever going to hold back the tides. How many people still think that story of King Canute was about a king who was so arrogant that he thought he could hold back the tides? And how many know that it is actually a story about a king trying to prove to his barons or to prove to his court that he wasn't omnipotent, that he was just a human, and that he couldn't actually hold back the tides? So let's not fall into the trap of thinking that misinformation is an entirely modern phenomenon. It's 10:48. It is 10 minutes to 11, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where the question of what do we teach children? How do we teach children how to spot fake news? This is the mission that Bridget Phillipson is setting teachers. She wants to arm pupils against what she calls putrid conspiracy theories. And Miles made some excellent points. I'm not quite as pessimistic as him about the impossibility of better regulating social media, because until Elon Musk bought Twitter, it was better regulated. You know, there were things that were beyond the remit of civilized society, and for reasons I don't think any of us will ever understand. Although I did watch Tomorrow Never Dies last night. I was on Scottish ITV. I don't know if it was on the rest of the network, but that's the film that I always have in the back of my mind when I find myself puzzling over why some of the richest people in the world want more power and more influence, and think that the best way to achieve it is perhaps by introducing some unhelpful or unhealthy elements into public discourse. I think that might be one of the best Bond films, you know. It does two things. It sounds a very big alarm about 21st century technological internet age media manipulation, and it also makes a pretty strong case for Pierce Brosnan being right up there with the best Bonds. I don't think he gets as routinely and regularly as he should. Just to be clear, I don't know whether it's because I am in an unfamiliar studio, but some of you apparently thought I was talking about King Canute a minute ago. No, I thought about King Canute with a T. It's not a word I want to dwell on unduly, because it could all get a bit North Kent Hunt. So it's King Canute with a T, who did not believe that he could hold back the tides of the Channel. He wanted to show his barons that he couldn't hold back the tides of the Channel. And yet, because misinformation is as old as the hills, that story still registers with many of us as a story about the precise opposite point than the one he was actually trying to make. Frank's in Carlisle. Frank, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. I was calling in to talk about, if you're teaching this, and I was a teacher for about 13 years, and I've taught parts of citizenship in addition to my regular subject. There's a load of things that you can't talk about. So you can't really talk too much about politics for fear of showing your own bias, which you're not allowed to talk about. So I'm a raving lefty, and I wasn't allowed to talk about all of my biases. But
who policed that? Who policed that?
Nobody does, really. But
you police yourself, and if you get into trouble, you get into trouble.
If a bunch of kids go into the next lesson and say, hey, sir was just talking about all of this, and he said all of the government said is completely wrong, then, questions are going to be asked. You're not supposed to.
But what if it is? What if it is completely wrong? What if it is disgusting to suggest that the police are not policing protests equally or fairly, as both Suella Braverman and Honest Bob Jenrick have done? What if that's what if that's a provable fact? Well, you're still not allowed to say it, are you?
You could look into it. What you wouldn't be wanting to say is that Tory politician's wrong, this Tory politician's wrong. You could look at crime. So, for example, I could say, let's study, has crime gone up or down? And you could look at one set of statistics which says violent crime has dropped over 10 years. You could look at another set of statistics that says shoplifting has massively increased. So which is right? Because it depends on what you look at. What about
if you said that police chiefs believe that attacks upon the police during the last Remembrance Sunday commemoration by the far right were inspired by the then Home Secretary Suella Braverman? Could you say that? because it's true. That's what police chiefs did say, and yet you could portray that as a political bias, couldn't you? Would you be able to say that?
One, isn't it? I think
I don't know. Is it?
You've got to be quite BBC about it and give both sides. If you don't
look where that's got us. That's got us to where I had to introduce Andrea Leadsom as a anyway. But that's not why you rang in. Where were we?
So I mean, I thought Miles had some really good stuff, and the point there was about getting kids to engage emotionally with the idea that something might be fake. And I had a colleague who taught me to be a teacher. She used to do a great thing with A-level general studies. She'd walk in, she'd pick a likely-looking kid who she knew could take it, and she'd whack him over the head with a newspaper just as she walked into the room. And that would start an argument about, was that fair, was that not? She'd say, well, it's your word against mine. I'm in charge. Nobody's going to believe you. And they'd get into a big discussion on it. And, the whole point of that, she knew the kid was not actually going to complain, but this was just to get people engaged. And I think, the critical thinking angle, that's definitely worth it. It's teaching people. You remember a little while ago, you had a phone in months or more ago about how do you teach kids what a good friend looks like. It's like that. You can't sort of just say good things look like this, bad things look like that. You've got to teach people how to figure it out for themselves to a degree. But I mean, to go to your first question of why are we in this spot? I mean, I think that the social media experiment is showing its colours here, because people expect, if you've heard a rumour, we're the same age. If we heard a rumour at school, then it would be somebody said something, you heard this. But now you see the 30-second video clip and you see all the commentary that goes with it. And then when 2 weeks later you see the 5 minutes before that 30-second clip and it changes. And, you could look at the Manchester airport incident. You could look at do you remember the one where there was a Jewish guy at the Palestinian marches who complained that he hadn't been allowed to cross the road, and then 15 minutes of him arguing with the police prior to that was broadcast, and it changed the narrative. So, things like that, I think we are basically in a situation where everything's been so much shortened and contracted, but looks so much more real.
So wait until you've got all the facts before you offer an opinion, which would apply to all of the examples you've provided. I'd add to that some of the responses which incited or probably incited the riots last week from politicians. Most obviously, I guess, Nigel Farage. We were talking last week about the importance of senior people, responsible people, saying wait until you know the facts before you frame a response. But social media has made that feel stupid. So why on earth am I going to wait for all the facts when I can get 5 million clicks by diving in there immediately?
The politics of trying to get clicks rather than trying to do good for the country, which is huge in America and pretty big here as well, where they're doing things just for reaction. That's basically what they're trying to do. We all do that a bit, don't we? So it's a question of policing the parameters of what is acceptable in the pursuit of attention and what is not acceptable. And the problem is, and I don't think this is a pet subject, because he was the most powerful man on the planet and might be again. But if you're a kid and you say something that you've picked up from Donald Trump, for example, that Kamala Harris used AI to doctor the size of her crowd this weekend, something that is irrefutably untrue, but a 10-year-old says, hey, that Kamala Harris used AI to doctor the size of her crowd, and you say, that's ridiculous. And he says, but President Trump said it. Yeah,
that's quite a big card to lay down on the table, isn't it?
It is. It's like, if you read it in a newspaper or you saw it on the TV, it must be true. Well, I mean, we know that's not true after years and years of living through that. But I think this is one that it's going to keep running. We don't really know what social media is going to do to a generation who grew up with it, and how they're going to turn out different to those of us who didn't. And
the next generation of social media as well, Frank. Of course, that the AI making it possible to create a clip of someone that makes it look like they are actually saying stuff that they are not saying. Teaching technology how to do that is going to be almost impossible, because technology learns from the technology. So you write some code to spot the fakes, and the creator of the fakes uses that code to make sure that his next fake won't get spotted by the code that you've written to spot the last fake. It's a remarkable state of affairs. And as Frank rightly reminds us, this conversation is far from over, but it's over for us for now, because we turn our attention next to the Home Secretary and her contention that riots show that people believe crime crime has no consequences, that Britain has lost respect for the police. Very few people have asked the question about just how many people were involved in the riots of last week and beyond. And if you do ask that question, the numbers are possibly too small to justify Yvette Cooper's conclusion. Or are they? It is a few minutes after 11 and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where we turn our attention next to the contention from the Home Secretary that the UK has lost respect for police. A couple of phone-ins I've wanted to do since the Farage riots got underway up and down the country while I was away, and then, of course, which we covered in some depth last week. One of which is not necessarily the one we're going to have now, but what's it like to be a police officer at the moment? Actually, I can put that question on the board. I'm always a little bit unclear on what you are and are not allowed to say to me. But remember, we can let you use a different name when you ring. And sometimes when police officers ring us about life on the front line, we can get, and by front line, I don't necessarily mean physically on the front line, as with the riots, but just in the midst of the job. I get insights I'm never going to get from anybody else. I remember during COVID, we took a call from a female officer who said something I will never forget. And she said, everyone's in favour of the police until they are the ones being policed. And I love that story for a number of reasons, but chiefly because it highlights how so much of media coverage of the police is dishonest and disingenuous. If, for example, you're a sort of ageing white bloke like me, and you've persuaded yourself that stopping and searching young black kids on an entirely disproportionate level is absolutely fine, then whether you realise it or not, part of the reason why you have arrived at that conclusion is because you know it's never going to affect you. And then when the somewhat draconian regulations surrounding COVID, because not only was the government being rather badly led at the time by Boris Johnson, but in their defence, they were dealing largely with unknown unknowns. So I better safe than sorry seemed at the time, and still does to me, to be a fairly reasonable response to the potential threat of COVID. It meant that people who were never going to be stopped and searched by a police officer who claims that he's detected a whiff of marijuana in 1 billion years were suddenly running the risk of being collared by cops despite having done absolutely nothing wrong. And what that line proved to me, everybody supports the police until they're the ones being policed, was the scale of the double standards in place on these issues. So all of the people who've spent decades banging on about how stopping and searching young black kids at a massively enhanced, greater scale than doing it to white kids may have an intellectual basis for their position. I'm yet to see it myself. But as soon as middle-aged white people became fair game for random stops and searches during COVID, they changed their minds completely. Sadly, it didn't stick, did it? It swung back the other way fairly quickly. But I am always interested in what it's actually like to be a copper. Now, if you were policing those riots, you were being exposed to genuine hatred, quite carefully cultivated hatred in some cases. The claims by Farage and others that the police were keeping information from the public, or that latterly that there's some form of two-tier policing in place in a country where last year Baroness Louise Casey's review into the Metropolitan Police found that it was institutionally racist, misogynistic and homophobic. But hey, tell me again how it actually secretly mitigates in favour of people from any or all of those minorities. So not only are you protecting us from these thugs, and in the case of the people who were violent at those riots, from these really unpleasant characters, but you're also getting attacked for doing so. You're also getting attacked at the same time, not just by the rioters with the bricks and the petrol bombs and the vicious attacks. The worst bit for me was probably the priest who told us that he'd found rioters trying to smash up gravestones outside his church so that they could throw the fragments at police officers. But you're also getting it in the neck from people like honest Bob Jenrick and Suella Braverman and others. Priti Patel did that terrible thing, that most mealy-mouthed of things at the moment, where she said that they need to address the perception of two-tier policing. That takes us back to the fake news conversation, doesn't it? Do we need to address the perception that Priti Patel is directly descended from the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz? Do you think we need to address that perception? Because I've heard that perception is quite a widespread perception that Priti Patel is the great-great-great-great-granddaughter of the Wicked Witch of the West in The Wizard of Oz. Or is the job of a responsible politician and journalist to say, well, I don't care what your perception is, that's absolute rollicks. She's decided to jump in one direction. Responsible politicians you would hope, jump in the other. So that police officer has not only got bits of gravestone raining down on his head as he tries to keep feral mobs of incited violent racists from burning down hotels containing asylum seekers, he then has to endure dialogue, a media and public dialogue, which is essentially accusing him of being part of some vicious conspiracy. It's absolutely awful. And then, again, to throw back a little to the conversation we had in the first hour of the program, and then if you expose yourself to some of the poison on social media, you've got people making all manner of claims about things that are simply not happening. For example, Keir Starmer has currently passed 0 laws. And yet, if you were sitting in, butt-cheek Mississippi, claiming to know more about the situation on the ground in London or England than people who actually live here, you'd be absolutely adamant that the first thing Keir Starmer did when he came into power was pass laws designed to limit your freedom of speech. Absolutely no suggestion that your freedom of speech will be limited. But if you go online to either encourage or indeed instruct people on how to, quote, riot or set fire to hotels containing asylum seekers, then you are obviously on very thin ice legally. And 'twas ever thus. So what's it like to be a police officer in this context? 0345 60 60 973 is the number that you need. But as ever, I want to go beyond today. I want to go a little bit deeper into this. I'd start with me, shall I? I have lost some respect for police in recent years. I stopped doing something, and I think I will probably start again. But whenever I found myself, and it was partly because of the geography of where I buy my coffee in the morning, whenever I found myself in the same queue as police officers, when I was buying my coffee or my breakfast in the morning, I would, not every single time because I'd be bankrupt, but I would often ask if they'd let me pay for their coffee, just as a mark of showing a little bit of gratitude and a little bit of respect for police officers. I still do it with the paramedics that go to my coffee shop. Indeed, there was a moment last summer where I thought that they were telling their mates to come along because they'd all get a free coffee. I'm joking. But I stopped doing that when the WhatsApp messages emerged from the Charing Cross police station, because that's the police station round the corner from where I work. And so I just caught myself respecting the police a bit less. The WhatsApp messages were, if you like, the shallow end of some of the stuff we discovered about messages officers were sharing with each other that were enough to make your hair fall out. I always have a very small side order here of medical school syndrome, or whatever you want to call it, where in order to do incredibly harrowing things, you have to go to a place psychologically and mentally to which the rest of us would never go. And that's why medical students will make jokes or use cadavers to do pranks, or not necessarily cadavers, but skulls and things that would scare the bejesus out of the rest of us. Sometimes medical students need to desensitize themselves in order to do the job that they do. And I understand that you might be able to apply some of that to the police, but you don't need me to remind you of the stories that illustrated just how much further than vaguely acceptable those instances have gone in recent years. And the WhatsApp messages, not least because they were so vile, but also because if you can talk about women like that amongst yourselves while they're in the room with you, but you're swapping messages, goodness knows what experiences those women have to endure that aren't necessarily going to make newspaper headlines. So I can tell you, at 10 o'clock this morning, I was going to do Don't Be Ridiculous. The UK hasn't lost the respect for police. Watching them police those riots last week has made me respect them more than ever. But I wouldn't be completely honest. The more I stopped to think about it, the more I realised that I was actually feeling a diminishment of my respect for police after the murder of Sarah Everard, of course, perhaps after the policing of the vigils, after the swapping of images of murdered black women, and of course that sense that if this is what some of them are doing, then that means that a lot of them are implicit or are complicit, forgive me, because if you sent me some of the messages that were reported last year, then I don't know where I'd go, whether I'd go to HR or whether I'd take you to one side or whether I'd phone the police. I don't know. But the response to that kind of behaviour suggests that the use of the word institutional in these cases is accurate. There is, for example, deep-seated homophobia in the Met. This is a report last year. Female officers and staff routinely face sexism and misogyny. So I can simultaneously say, thank God for the thin blue line, when race riots, start erupting once again on our streets. But yeah, in terms of the some of the individuals, then yeah, I've got a different view than I had a few years ago. And I know a lot of listeners of colour, particularly black listeners, get cross with me when I say this, but I grew up as me. I didn't grow up as you. I didn't have the experiences that you had. I wasn't exposed to experiences that made me mistrustful of the police. Quite the opposite, in fact. But I have, since doing this job, learned an awful lot more about what I suppose you could call multi-tier policing, two-tier policing, and the fact that if you are of one ethnicity, you're a lot more likely, for example, to die in custody than you are if you're another. So, what is going on here? I don't think you can argue with Yvette Cooper. I was minded to, but then I realised that in some way I have lost respect for police, if not for the badge. But there'll be a million different reasons why this has happened. Some of it will have to do with the behaviour of the police themselves, which is my case. And a lot of it, to tie back with the conversation in the last hour, will have to do with believing lies being told about the police by the same people who in many ways incited the race riots that we saw last week. So Britain has lost respect for the police, the Home Secretary claims today in the wake of the riots. She wants to restore the public's faith in the law, as she warns would-be rioters that the streets will be flooded with officers this week. So a bit like the conversation we had in the last hour, how did we get there and how do we get back to normality? Why has the UK lost respect for the police? You can come at it subjectively or objectively. You can tell me why you have, or you can tell me why you think a broader society has. And you can, of course, tell me that you don't think broader society has. The number remains the same, 0345 6060 973. But just as we asked how Bridget Phillipson might help school children come to a better understanding of what fake news is, how can Yvette Cooper restore our faith, your faith, my faith in the police? 0345 6060 973. Remember, you can text me on 84850 or WhatsApp me on 0345 6060 973. I'm going to read this, actually, because I think it's probably important. Very quickly, James, on your coffee point. You have no idea how much a small gesture like that makes such a difference to a cop's day, especially if they've been at something difficult beforehand. The hardest thing about policing these days is the effects that good officers experience resulting from the actions of bad officers, such as those in Charing Cross that you mentioned. But I am very glad that you're discussing this. And I know that you're right. And next time I'm in the queue, I'll put my hand in my pocket again. Because you can't, can you, tar everybody with the same brush? Otherwise you end up being part of the problem rather than searching for the solution, which we will start doing together after this. 11:19, Maggie says the media is partly responsible for the lack of respect for the police. You're not wrong. I mean, there's a bit of racism involved there as well, I think, sometimes, Maggie. Whenever I hear people complaining about officers dancing at Notting Hill Carnival, for example, I find myself wondering why they don't express similar disapproval or similar actions when officers get engaged in a bit of banter with at events that aren't celebrating Caribbean culture. But I think most most of these people know what they're doing. Again, we spoke to a senior officer. It may have been the same woman, I'm not sure. But it was another female police officer who said, if I've got an officer, if I'm in charge of an operation at the Notting Hill Carnival and I've got an officer on duty, he has an earpiece in, or he has his radio with him, and he might be dancing with someone at 19 minutes and 12 seconds after 11 o'clock. But if I send out a message that I need him to be somewhere else, then at 19 minutes and 12 seconds after 11 o'clock, he'll be on his toes. Do you really need to explain that to people? If you're policing a gay pride event in a country where police were arresting gay men within living memory, there will be people on a bus, on a float at a gay pride event who ran the risk of actual arrest in their own lifetimes, and the police decide to try a little bit harder than they have historically to be welcoming, to be inclusive. Maybe there's one helmet that has the pride rainbow on it and there's a police officer wearing it, and people pretending to believe that means they're not out catching murderers or catching thieves are indulging in homophobia, whether they realise it or not. You make those comments about the carnival, you're being a bit racist. You make those comments about police at Pride, you're being a bit homophobic, because if they were trying to make you feel comfortable at your gathering, then you wouldn't have any problem with it at all. But you don't like it when they're doing it for the gays or the people of colour. So all sorts of issues why the police may have lost some respect. And Maggie's dead right. A lot of it will be the usual right-wing blowhards attacking the police for trying to be nice to minorities, because, well, you can fill in the gaps yourself. But I still want to know what it's like to be in the job at the moment when you're getting it would seem, from all angles. Not only are you getting bricks thrown at your head by racist rioters, but you're also getting accused of somehow being too hard on the racist rioters by politicians who frankly should know better. Dan's in Croydon to kick things off. Dan, what would you like to say?
James, apologies. My relevant experience expired 2 years ago, so I'm a retired police officer, and I know
2 years. 2 yeyears is okay, isn't it? But I do worry sometimes that radio phone-ins get what's the word? Get hijacked by people who left the job 30 years ago. But 2 years is helpful, Dan, I think, to be fair.
Okay, so my opinion, I guess for once it's in tune with yours, is that it's a lot to do with the news and social media, because everything I see is negative. I very, very rarely see anything positive, and a lot of it seems to be cultured and manufactured to be negative. So are you aware what auditors are? Are you aware of what that new phenomenon is?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I know what the word auditor means, but not in the context necessarily of this conversation.
Okay, so there's an explosion of YouTube and Twitter and all other platforms, auditors. And what they do is they go around searching for content on their phones to create negative interactions with the police, which they then post. And all these interactions are completely contrived. They wouldn't have occurred if they hadn't have gone there in the first place. And of course, if you're looking for negativity, that's what you're going to find. And because that gets more clicks, doesn't it? And it's all about clicks. I don't quite know how you get paid on YouTube and the other platforms, but I guess they're looking to earn a living out of it. Volume. The more people engage with your account, the more money you get if you've paid for a blue tick, or even if you get a blue tick for free. I think it still works. So I was looking at, the guys, the right-wing guys. Don't give publicity to people who we don't want to give publicity to. Speak, and maybe this is wrong, but this is the call I'm going to make. Let's speak a bit in the abstract rather than giving attention to people who are clearly so desperate for it. Tell me what they do, not who they are. Okay, so the demonstrations last week, the far-right demonstrations. The riots. The riots, right. Yeah. A lot of the guys who you could see in the background were YouTubers and auditors looking for negative interactions, which they could then post on their platforms, which get clicks, which cause a bad impression, well, not just of the police, but of everybody, I suppose. And nobody likes good news, do they? Especially about the police. It's not particularly interesting, but bad news is particularly interesting. And also I think it's a lot about to do the transference of unhappiness. Like, if I get up today and I'm not feeling particularly happy, if I make you feel unhappy, that makes me feel a lot better. That's does it? Very briefly, doesn't it? Very briefly. But in society, I don't know, perhaps 2 years ago, things have changed, but people were pretty unhappy 2 years ago after COVID. I think people are even more unhappy now. And everybody's looking for somebody to hang their
hat on, aren't they? And it just so happens that at the moment it's the police because they're very convenient.
Damaging. Yeah, I mean, it is very convenient and particularly virulent, I think, given that they're risking their life and limb last week on a nightly basis to protect ordinary citizens, peaceful citizens and asylum seekers. I don't mean they're not ordinary or peaceful. I just mean they're not citizens yet. But the idea that you're simultaneously getting attacked by the rioters and then attacked essentially for policing the riots must be incredibly demoralising. It's always interesting, isn't it, to work out what's new and what's not new. So there are two universes, Dan. I think you and I live in the same one, albeit that you're not agreeing with all of my views yet. But we live in the one where we know what's happening on social media. We see stuff that we find repellent, and we see people that we find repulsive spreading their bile for as you say, clicks. And some of them, of course, are in mainstream politics and mainstream media. Some of them are in Parliament now. So how much damage does it do outside of the social media world when people like Priti Patel talk about a perception of two-tier policing, which is a very mealy-mouthed way of saying, well, I know there isn't any, but people think there is. So we're back to legitimate concerns. Police have to be criticised, but how much damage does it do when they're criticised for things that they have no control over and which are almost certainly not true?
Well, it just amplifies. I mean, where did this come from? Who thought of that phrase, two-tier policing? Because I've never heard of it before until this year.
It was introduced into British public discourse by Stephen Yaxley Lennon's cousin, a co-founder of the EDL. I think that's the sort of first recorded instance of it, but it's a very well-established far-right trope in America, which is, it's designed to teach people that up is down and that, the country in which brutality against black people by police is absolutely endemic. You're telling people, actually, no. Ignore the evidence of your eyes and ears. It's the other way round. And then obviously people like Farage and Honest Bob Jenrick and Braverman and Priti Patel have run with it, as they've run with so many other far-right tropes from the other side of the Atlantic. But how much damage does it do to morale or even to operational matters?
Well, I was with friends this weekend and people were questioning me about two-tier policing and what my opinion was on it. And do I think that the Palestine marches every Saturday are being policed in the same way as the far-right marches? It starts a conversation which shouldn't even really be there in the first place. And if people like Priti Patel give it credence and reality, then it just makes it seem real, doesn't it? I mean, if I tell you a lie enough times, you're eventually going to believe me, aren't you? Well, you probably
you're going to think there must be something.
Do.
Well, no, I won't. But you might start thinking there's something in it. And I don't want to insult your friends, but they somehow just ignore the fact that the marches calling for a ceasefire in Gaza have not involved petrol bombs or hotels being set alight or the police being routinely bombarded with missiles and projectiles by almost everybody in attendance, or wheelie bins being set on fire or shops being looted. There are instances of criminality and they are relatively few and far between. Therefore, the issue of policing is completely different from the issue of policing in a context where violence is absolutely commonplace. Police and civilians are under complete threat. Cars are being set on fire. I mean, I suppose I'm asking, how stupid are your friends? How much sympathy do you have for where they've been led by some of the people that we've just been alluding to?
Steve, I don't know. When I come off the phone, I'll text them and say, James O'Brien's posed me a question. So I think one of the main things is a lot of people, from what I can see, I don't know whether or not this is true, but a lot of people don't buy papers. They don't look at various news sources. They don't look at independent news sources. A lot of people get their news sources today from TikTok, Facebook and the internet, and that's why you see so many people just sitting on their phones all day. And the thing is, if you look at TikTok, the algorithm detects what you like to look at, and then it shows you what you want to look at.
So again, aren't we?
But listen, it's so true.
And they've not been anywhere near. Well, I don't know if I am. I can't be. But we're back to the algorithm. And of course, the people you're talking about have never been near a ceasefire march in their lives. But if there is some footage of one person behaving badly or 10 people behaving badly, they think that's what the whole march is like, as opposed to the tens of thousands of people who are behaving in a completely civilised and, I would say, British fashion.
Yeah, absolutely. I just think people need to broaden their information sources and try and see what's real, try try and draw a line between reality and fantasy, but it's becoming increasingly harder, especially...
It's turned into the last hour. This conversation has turned into the last hour again, hasn't it?
Oh, sorry.
That's all right. I just saying it's another conversation about how you spot what's fake and what is not fake. Dan, thank you. If you're just tuning in, Dan described himself at the outset of that call as a recently retired police officer, 2 years out of the job, who usually doesn't agree with me about anything. So I'm not mentioning that in a snarky fashion. It's just interesting the ground that we're converging on here when it comes to all of the issues and many of the individuals that pop up quite a lot on this programme. Almost makes you wonder what on earth it could be that he disagrees with me about. Thomas Watts is here now with your headlines. It is 32 minutes after 11. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Home Secretary warns that the UK has lost respect for police. I think we're looking at the whys of it and the wherefores, although you are... I suppose the problem is, I do get this a bit. You sort of say, no, that doesn't exist. It's never happened to me. And you sort of think, well, you might never have had smallpox, but it doesn't mean that smallpox wasn't real. You might never have had malaria. It doesn't mean that malaria isn't real. You may never have had a cold, the common cold. So just because it's never happened to you, it was empty shelves, wasn't it? When a lot of the Brexit privations were kicking in, a lot of the self-inflicted harms on our import and export, well, import in particular of food, and it was, I think you can all see still the difference in produce that's on our shelves now in the grocery aisle, the green grocery aisle. And I'd get messages, I'd say literally, you'd be saying, or you'd take calls and say, well, yeah, I was in Morrison's yesterday and it's the first time I can ever remember seeing empty spaces. And someone would go, well, I haven't seen any empty spaces, so this can't possibly be true. And you sort of go, no, mate, that's not how reality works. The world is not confined to what you can see out of your window any more than it's confined to what I can see out of mine. So you may not have lost respect for the police, but half an hour into this conversation, I think that Yvette Cooper's point is probably true nonetheless. It feels as if parts of the community, large parts of the community, are, if you like, less respectful of the police than we used to be. Tomorrow, the UK's former head of counter-terrorism, served as an assistant commissioner for specialist operations in the Metropolitan Police, Neil Basu, has had quite a lot to say about recent events. Will be joining us, not in the studio, but so it'd be tricky for him to take your calls. But if there's anything that you want me to put to him, then do get it in front of me before then. So that's a reason to tune in tomorrow. The next hour of the programme, I'm drawn to this conversation I heard Nick having earlier about medals, because I came at it from a completely different perspective from him. Do you remember me telling you about Georgia Bell, the 1,500 metre runner, getting quite excited about it because her mum taught my girls PE? So we've been quite a ringside seat on that story. And I honestly don't think that Georgia's bronze medal that she won in the 1,500 metres the other night, and I told almost everyone I know to put money on Georgia Bell to win a bronze medal in the 1,500. I don't know why I picked bronze. I told hundreds of people. I may even have told you. Did I tell you? If I did, I should get 15% at least, because I didn't do it myself. I can remember doing it. I was on the tube thinking I must place a bet, and then it just went out of zone so that I didn't have a signal. And when I got back onto the signal, I'd forgotten that I was going to put a bet on it. I don't know what odds you get if you specify the actual medal before the heats had even started. And somewhere in the back of my mind, I thought I'd placed the bet, and then I went to look at my account and I hadn't. And anyway, I got more excitement watching her win a bronze medal than I did watching some athletes win gold. So I'm just really interested in what this idea that silver and bronze don't really count, it's all about the gold. Something I probably would have agreed with once, and still might when we have the phone in, but I want to talk about that in the next hour. Do you know what it reminded me of? It reminded me of when people used to get their pants in a bunch about school sports days, making sure that every kid felt valued. And I'm afraid to admit that I very much used to be. In my days before therapy, I think, is probably the cut-off point. I was very much of the view that making most children on sports day feel sad and inadequate was a good thing and character forming and would help them understand the unfairness of life and reality itself. I don't know whether it's a story that fits into the same space, but we'll find out after 12. Back to the police, back to the perception that the UK has lost respect for the police, or indeed the statement from the Home Secretary that the UK has lost respect for the police. And if you fancy it, well, it may be time to have a look at how you restore it. But it is interesting how much of this conversation has fallen into a very similar space to the conversation we were having in the last hour about what happens when people believe things that aren't true and what we can do about helping them to a place where they can recognise the difference between right and wrong again. Ryan is in Bristol. Ryan, what would you like to say?
Hello, James. I'm a long-time listener and first-time caller. I'm a little bit nervous.
Welcome. It's only me. It's only me.
Yeah, of course. So I was in the military for a number of years before I joined the police. I've only been in just over a year now, actually.
Okay.
And I want to thank you, first of all, for raising this question and raising this point. I think it's a little bit underappreciated is probably the best word to use.
Yeah.
I want to give you an example of something that's happened recently. We had a bomb threat in a town centre fairly recently, and we were trying to contain that area. When we were doing that, obviously there's a lot of officers involved. There is a lot of risk involved. It was a Saturday night. As I'm sure you can imagine, there was a lot of people in the town centre drinking, being merry and things. And we unfortunately had to evacuate a lot of the clubs and pubs and things like that. Upon doing so, one of the officers on this cordon was attacked by a member of the public when he was simply asking them to leave. And
no, I mean that presumably the member of the public was
was
tanked up, and so the not to split hairs, but that could have happened at any point in the last 50 years, couldn't it? Or are we looking at something new?
But I think due to the lack of respect of officers, obviously being drunk is going to be a factor of it.
Yes.
But the lack of respect that we see for officers on a daily basis is horrific. I mean, I'm quite thick-skinned. I don't really get offended by a lot of things, but another example, we arrested a gentleman the other day. Obviously, I'm not going to give names or anything like that. But,
sure. You better not.
He essentially, no, I know. He essentially arrested himself. I mean, we were going to arrest him anyway, but he literally knelt down on the floor, put his hands behind the back, and said, "Arrest me." And so, obviously, at that point, I said, "Yes, fine." I was already going to, and you've now sort of given the opportunity. So we did that, and then from then on, he was screaming, hurling abuse, saying that I was a bully and all this other things, and I was like, you do realise that you asked me to arrest you. Obviously, that's not the reason that I've done it, but you see what I mean.
Yes.
And, the general respect that officers, or the general, disrespect that officers get. I mean, there was an officer the other day that was getting calls from a withheld number on their work phone saying horrific things about them for absolutely no reason. This officer didn't even know who this person actually was.
So someone had got hold of the phone number.
Yeah. And, it's from a lot of things. There is a lot of understaffing at the moment. There's obviously, the last government got rid of thousands and thousands of police officers, and that's caused an understaffing issue within all of the police forces across the country. And we routinely find ourselves in briefing rooms not even being able to fill up 10 seats. So we are very often understaffed, and we constantly have hundreds and hundreds of logs come in a day that we have to try and deal with. Some of
that situation is exacerbated enormously by the riot scenarios, and also, of course, by the deployments that are made necessary in order to ensure, or to try to ensure, that we don't have a return to the scenes of violence, the horrible scenes that we saw last week. I'd also add, while I'm currying favour with the thin blue line, Ryan, I'd also add that this phrase extra police officers isn't very helpful, is it? When I read or I hear that we've got 2,000 extra police officers, they're not extra police officers. They're police officers who've had their leave cancelled or who've had their rest days ridden roughshod over. They're people who are being put on duty who would not otherwise be put on duty. So extra police officers is a slightly unhelpful phraseology, I think. What about this two-tier question? I'm reading a report from the head of the Runnymede Trust, which is a rather splendid equality organisation, talking about how this really amounts to racist gaslighting. Sir Mark Rowley, head of the Met, of course, has described it as complete nonsense. But crucially, what I'm asking you about, he says it's putting officers at risk.
Yes. Yes, it is. The idea of two-tier policing, I mean, no matter where you are in the country, things that happen, for example, when things are happening in the Met, you will be affected in other areas because everybody thinks that the police is governed by the exact same bodies, which obviously it's not.
It's incredible,
to a
isn't
degree.
it? Yes.
Chief constables are different in every county, and that's quite obvious to somebody that actually understands it. But for the general members of the public, unfortunately, people think that we're all governed by the exact same person, which we're not. But the whole idea of two-tier policing it's fanciful, to say the least.
Yes. I wonder why it lands. I wonder why people are ready to believe it. You think that Mark Rowley has said these ludicrous claims are putting my officers at risk, and people like Farage continue to talk about it. He is either deciding he understands policing better than Mark Rowley does, or he's comfortable with the idea that he's putting police officers at risk with his what the Runnymede Trust have called racist gaslighting.
Yeah, what Nigel Farage refuses to understand is that obviously he is not a police officer, and the whole idea of two-tier policing, unfortunately, it's not the issue itself. It gives gas to the light, if that makes sense. It gives them something to be angry about.
Well, that means Priti Patel can talk about.
We're going to go out and do something about it.
And you're also going to be more likely to be negative towards you when you are arresting someone, because you're going to think that you're arresting me because I'm white, or you're arresting me because I'm protesting against whatever it is they were protesting against. It's quite hard to pin down precisely how you're helping commemorate the crimes committed against children by committing crimes potentially against children, or certainly by terrorising children. Ryan, briefly, the difference between being a copper and a soldier when it comes to how you feel the public look at you.
It is definitely different. It's a little bit strange. I mean, when I was a soldier, I think obviously you conceal it in public because there is that security issue. There are obviously times when we have to go out in uniform in public for whatever reason. And you did, as a soldier, get respect. People wouldn't really speak to you, but when they did, they would offer you, free drinks at the counter at McDonald's or things like that. And people would look at you, and do you know what I mean? You get that look from people that they don't hate you.
Whereas as a police officer, you get the opposite.
Side eyes and
really.
Yeah,
I'm sorry to hear that, and I think that's why it's important for people like you to ring people like me, and for people like me to have more conversations like the one that we're currently having, because this is one of the last lines of defence against chaos, against anarchy, against breakdowns in civilization, which makes the decision of media figures and indeed politicians to add to the heat that is being placed on people like Ryan all the more despicable and disgusting. And speaking of soldiers, this one has asked me not to read his name, and it is quite a distinctive name, so I won't. James, I had the privilege to go on shift with my younger brother, who is a traffic officer, recently. I was in total astonishment for the entire shift as he, on his own, dealt with all manner of road policing and, frankly, all types of policing, as we also went to domestics that other units couldn't get to. His bravery was constant, and his ability not to be brought down by the amount of abuse he received made me very proud. I simply cannot tell you how hard each shift was. Are you ready for the kicker? I've kind of given it away. And I'm a soldier, which I hope contextualises what police officers go through. I hope so too, mate. It's 11:45. It is 11:47, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC, where everyone should be sad, shouldn't they, that the UK has lost respect for the police. But it doesn't mean that the UK is wrong to have lost some respect for the police. So I've spoken so far to coppers, both currently in the job and recently in the job, who I would be happy to support, who I'd be happy to throw my weight behind, such as my weight is. But I have lost respect for the police service, partly as a result of some of the stories that have emerged in recent years regarding their conduct, particularly on WhatsApp groups, and obviously in the context of some very, very serious crimes that have been committed by serving officers. I can mention Sarah Everard without having to mention her murderer, but of course the other the serial rapist that we also learned about. I can't. I don't want to say his name. I don't want to provide any sort of form of infamy towards these people, but some really horrible crimes, and one of them in particular seemed to contain the almost undigestible knowledge that his colleagues thought he was dodgy. And yet did nothing. But then you get the Casey report, which essentially found that Britain's largest police force is institutionally racist, misogynist and homophobic. Interesting that Mark Rowley was unhappy with the use of the phrase institutionally racist. He wasn't sure that people would understand exactly what it meant, and worried that some of his officers would end up being unfairly maligned. But of course, he's made no bones about the fact that using the phrase two-tier policing in the way that Nigel Farage frequently does, he believes actually puts police officers at risk. And the head of the Runnymede Trust, the equality think, highly respected equality think tank, has contended that the phrase itself is racist gaslighting, which is pretty much true. It just is true. Charlie's in Manchester. Charlie, what made you pick up the phone?
James, I was a police officer for over 5 years, and I left about a year ago.
Okay.
And also, to put it in context, my boyfriend is currently a serving police officer and refuses to leave. One of the reasons...
Refuses to leave? So that makes it sound like you would quite like him to.
I would very much like him to. I've been extremely worried about him the last week or so when he's been attending these riots. And one of the reasons I chose to leave was because of the negative publicity, the negative press. And I pointed out to your researcher that Lucy Letby has recently been in the news for terrible crimes. And we didn't all suddenly become fearful of nurses. But unfortunately, when there's occasions where police officers are in the news, we seem to latch on to their occupation, even if the incident has happened outside of work. And I do think that the press cover incidents that involve police officers a lot more than they do with other occupations. And also, occupations don't usually come into it. So I arrested someone while I was a police officer who was serving, again, a nurse. That just came to mind. And she did end up in the press, but it was not mentioned at all that she was a nurse. It was just the crime that she committed that she was convicted of.
I'm going to push back a little bit, but I'm going to do so affectionately. The point is that your job is to uphold law and order. Therefore, if you breach law and order, it is more newsworthy. Your job is an intrinsic part of that story, in a way that if someone whose job is to keep us healthy breaches law and order, it's not the same equation. The Lucy Letby example is sound because, if she has been found to have done the absolute opposite of the Hippocratic Oath. She has been found to do harm. So and she couldn't have committed her crimes unless she was a nurse. So I think there's a lot to complain about. I don't think that is necessarily the thing that should be at the top of your list, not least because I found, I turned to the Louise Casey review, admittedly not your force, but the Met, the biggest force in the country. You've got 22% of staff with protected characteristics experiencing bullying from other officers, 33% of those with a long-standing illness, disability or infirmity. You're finding deep-seated homophobia. Almost 1 in 5 lesbian, gay and bisexual employees had experienced it. 30% said they had been bullied. You've got obviously black officers, I say obviously, 81% more likely to be in the misconduct system than white colleagues. You've got so many examples of institutional racism, misogyny and homophobia in the actual Met, in an actual inquiry conducted by Baroness Louise Casey into the Metropolitan Police after a police officer murdered Sarah Everard. So I don't think this is the best grievance for you to bring to the table. The idea that... Do you see what I mean? Because what we rejected a couple of years ago was the bad apple. There was too much of it going on for the bad apple theory to hold. The opposite of bad apple theory is institutional, and it's institutional, not bad apple. Lucy Letby, bad apple.
Absolutely. Do you see what I mean? No one can argue with the statistics that you've just given. But I do think that the press do latch on to a police officer's occupation if something happens. And unfortunately, that is what has led to public mistrust. I do think things have changed.
I think the low-level stuff is worse. I don't think anybody looks at the murder of Sarah Everard and thinks you're all murderers. But I think that the coverage of Dancing at Carnival or wearing, you mentioned your boyfriend's a copper, so you'll have more perhaps personal interest in Pride events than I do, but wearing a rainbow helmet at Pride or working hard to build up relationships with sections of the community that would once have been very frightened of the police, the idea that that is not a good thing to do, the effort that right-wing media puts into maligning individual officers, that is where they're trying to tar everybody with the same brush, because they create the idea you're too busy trying to be nice to people at Pride or people at Carnival than you are catching crooks or chasing robbers.
And the sad thing is that sort of outreach in the police force, it happens across all of society. So it's not just at gay pride events. It's not just, I know that while I was a police officer, invited to celebrate Eid with some of my fellow Muslim officers, which I thought was fantastic. These things happen across all of society, but certain things are latched onto. And unfortunately, there is people that want to be offended by these things, see these things and don't see them as a positive. And unfortunately, that does affect public confidence in policing.
Do you know what? I hadn't thought of it that way around. Because what it does, of course, that these incidents are designed, these examples are designed, diversity, inclusion, whatever description you prefer, to minimise the likelihood of the scenes we saw last week. But by the way that they're presented to the public by a certain type of journalist and politician, they actually end up exacerbating division and contributing to an ecosystem or the creation of the sort of tinder that was ignited last week. I sense, Charlie, I think I know the answer to this question. You've had no... I don't think you've got any regrets about leaving the police, but I suspect you wish that you hadn't reached a place where you thought that you had to.
Oh, massively so. I'm really disappointed that... it was my career for life, and then unfortunately it just wasn't what I expected. And you talk about lack of confidence in policing, but that also applies to police officers, because they go to work every single day, and they're told that these terrible things are happening. Police are all terrible. They're all racist. They're all murderers. Whatever. Obviously, not in those exact words, but it affects individual police officers' confidence in going to work, and it affects how they feel about their role, exactly the same way that it does a normal member of the public looking in on the police force. And unfortunately, policing nowadays, every time a police officer goes to any kind of job, they're arresting someone, there is a camera in their face. And what people forget is there's usually a very fast-paced situation. They're only human beings, and they have to make a decision incredibly quickly. And sometimes they do make mistakes, but people latch onto those mistakes and won't allow police officers to learn from them. Unfortunately, the culture in the police isn't great in terms of learning from your mistakes, and
or even admitting them in the first place. And part of that is because the way that it's latched onto, and unfortunately, people aren't allowed to learn from their mistakes because it's expected that police officers should never make them. That's brilliantly put. It's also instant reputation protection. It happens with any institution, whether it's a school or whether it's a police force. If a problem arises, the first priority is protecting the institution, which is why things like child sexual abuse went properly unreported or unpunished for so long, because the schools involved were trying to protect themselves, and the same with almost every institution. I don't know how you change that. A mandatory reporting would help in all of those examples, but it is an almost gut reaction, an almost reflex. Post office, there you go. I knew there was an example in the back of my mind. Some of the coverage that has emerged in the post office inquiry has been extraordinary, in that they actually said it out loud, that prioritising protecting our reputation is more important than acknowledging the wrongdoing that we have been responsible for. And Charlie, thank you, mate. And I wonder how many of you thought of Adam Kelwick while Charlie was talking there about division and about attempts to build bridges. This is someone I'd quite like to talk to, actually. It comes from, I think it was the oldest mosque in England that was attacked during the riots. And Adam has essentially dedicated himself to trying to speak to the people, or the type of people that were attacking him. And they've had some extraordinary success. What I loved was the description I read of him taking food outside to actually try and engage with some of the potential rioters, and they all ignored him, and then someone took some food and started talking, and once someone had broken that line, lots of other people followed. So the sense that the best way to undo this sort of thing, the best resistance against the racist gaslighters or the riot inciters or the people in my profession who sometimes don't realise how dangerous they're being, is to encourage dialogue between the people who think they don't like each other. We had all these amazing discussions, he said, and right towards the end of the discussion there was a moment, and it really was a light bulb, and it's like people are trying to play us against each other here, aren't they? He said, and everyone realised at the same time, and it was just like, wow. And that was a comment not from the Imam, but from one of the protest attendees who had sought a meeting with him. I think we'll have a look at that story in a little bit more detail tomorrow. And I would mention well, I'll tell you actually after this, but there's something I just want to tell you briefly, because Charlie referenced the Lucy Letby case. It's 3 minutes after 12. Thank you for choosing LBC today. I just in passing, I didn't mention it then because it wasn't relevant to the point that Charlie was making, but quite a few of you drawing my attention to something you didn't need to draw my attention to. There are quite a lot of questions being asked about the safety of Lucy Letby's convictions. I'd recommend a double-page spread in the Times today. I mentioned the Times. Private Eye, Phil Hammond at Private Eye has done a lot on it as well. I'm not fully across it. I certainly don't have a view, but I didn't want you to think I wasn't aware of the seriousness, the probity, if you like, of some of the people posing some of these questions. And another nod back to the conversation we've had in the last 2 hours. I couldn't bear some of the coverage this weekend. Now that the families of the little girls who died in Southport have come forward with their stories, I couldn't bear it. The Taylor Swift angle, I know there's probably not a father of daughters in the land who hasn't had an awful lot of exposure to Taylor Swift, and please remember that the case is still very, very live, so we have to be very careful what we say, and we have to watch our P's and Q's. I will always try my very best to err on the side of caution, and indeed to be better safe than sorry. But the coverage of what the families have been through, almost unbearable. A little nod this morning to Sergio and Alexandra da Silva Aguirre, who conducted themselves with quite extraordinary dignity and published a letter to their daughter that was unbearably beautiful. And they have called for an end to the violent riots that followed her death. They've done so in a very diplomatic fashion, but I don't know quite how you process. I can't imagine they've even had the bandwidth to process the absurdity of terrorising children potentially in response to these events. But they reminded me of another Alice actually, and I'll mention this because the same kind of people that are talking about two-tier policing, and the same kind of people who helped to incite the riots by suggesting that the police were keeping stuff from us, or that the suspect might have been known to the security services. Extraordinary irresponsibility, truly disgusting conduct. But the public space has become so polluted in the last few years that it didn't really register at the time just how disgusting that behaviour was. They add their names to two others that I would give you, actually. The families of both Alice Gross and Lee Rigby have also called for individuals, movements to stop using their loved ones' deaths as political capital in often quite pungent discourse. And sadly, Alice Gross's family were ignored, and Lee Rigby's family continued to be ignored by precisely the kind of people who were likely to be throwing petrol bombs at the police last week, or, of course, if they wear suits and ties, likely to be making comments about the security services or about the police. So I hope that these poor parents don't get added to that hideous list, but I'm not massively optimistic. Speaking of optimism, change of pace completely now, much happier conversation this hour than the previous ones. If the medal tables at the Olympics were totals, if you were listing according to totals, do you know where Great Britain would have come? Do you know where Great Britain would have come? I did a bit of a double take when I looked at this morning. We would have come third. We had the highest total number of medals of all the countries in the world. And of course, we are far from the biggest. In fact, when it comes to total medals, we were beaten only by the United States and China. And I think that's an extraordinary achievement. But if you, as indeed the medals table does, if you focus first and usually exclusively on how many gold medals Great Britain won, then we actually came 7th. And the reason why I say usually exclusively is because if there's a tie for gold medals, then you look at silver. And if there's a tie for silver, then you look at bronze. And if there's, in highly unlikely circumstances, there also being a tie for bronze, I presume you look at how many 4th places, even though that wouldn't necessarily constitute a medals table, or you call it a dead heat. And you crown 2 different countries with the same title, the same accolade. So it's interesting, this, because it's described as Britain's worst performance in the Olympic medal table for 20 years. There's only one newspaper that's really gone on in this angle, but it is, indubitably correct. It's statistically correct. This is not an opinion. This is counting. Because the medal table operates according to how many golds a competing country received, Britain came 7th, and that makes it, in terms of the total number of golds, that makes it our worst performance in 20 years. But if you look at all the medals, then we came 3rd. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should change the way... I mean, you can't, can you, as a Brit? You'd have to wait until somebody else was in our position. Otherwise, it just sounds like you're trying to big yourself up, trying to move the goalposts after the final whistle has been blown. But you won't have been surprised to learn that on Saturday night, we watched Georgia Bell, whose mother taught my daughter's PE at their primary school and whose dad is the political editor of 5 News, who I used to work with many, many moons ago. Truly lovely man, lovely couple, really lovely, lovely people. I've never met Georgia. But you know when you have a little connection like that and it's suddenly everything gets magnified, everything gets more exciting. So Georgia Bell, if you don't know her story, was watching the Olympics last time round, watching the Olympics in Tokyo, when her mum pointed out that a couple of the female athletes who were doing quite well in the middle distance running used to get beaten by her when she was a schoolgirl champion, when she was one of the best runners of her generation. She then went to college in America, I think on an athletic scholarship, and didn't respond well to the way that they trained her. There was loads and loads and loads of high-impact distance training. And she said, I think she was there for 2 years, and she spent one of them in a boot. You know, those boots that people wear when they've got a fracture in their bone or a broken bone. And so she essentially gave it up. And then during lockdown, after the experiences of seeing athletes she used to race against in Tokyo, she decided to go for a park run. Literally a park run, the one that everyone does, and the ones about which people can often be quite boring. She went on a park run and came 2nd, in her own words, to a man, and thought, I really enjoyed that. So she just dipped her toe back into it. She's 30 now. She works in cybersecurity. She dipped her toe back into it, and she just kept getting faster and faster. So she got back in touch with her coaches, a husband and wife couple who look after some of our best middle distance runners, including Keely Hodgkinson. And all the pieces just started coming together. And it culminated on Saturday night in her winning a bronze medal at the Olympics. Now, I found that, for me, because of the very vague and nebulous glory hunting personal connection, I found that a little bit, I found that considerably more exciting than anything else that we saw in Paris. I loved Keely Hodgkinson's run. And I loved the young lad. What was his name? Was it Toby? The 21-year-old who flew up. I told you that the speed climbing and the various other iterations of climbing events were desperately exciting, didn't I? But I found her bronze at least as uplifting and in many ways more inspiring than many of the other medals. That's why I'm drawn to this notion of it's gold or nothing. This is nice from Jake. I wasn't expecting this. Hey, James, it's great to hear you talking about the Olympics. I've been over in Paris supporting my wonderful partner, Bryony Page, who completed the set winning gold. Indeed, she did. And you can't take away, no one can ever even begin to chip away at the notion of gold not being gold. Gold is the gold standard. But should we actually be a little bit more, or is there anything wrong with being very, very excited about silver and bronze? I've never quite got this. I don't think I have. I've never quite got the idea that, well, you're a loser or you lost. I know technically it's true, but there's a reason why there are 3 medals. If the Olympics were supposed to reflect the idea that unless you win, you lose, then there wouldn't be medals for second and third. What is a medal if not an honour? And the narrative that says if it's not gold, it's nothing, that actually dishonours the people that... He's 19, is he, the climber? Yeah, I think you're right. He's 19. Good Lord. But if he'd won a silver, it would still be absolutely magical, wouldn't it? Do you see what I mean? So I don't quite know what the question that I'm asking you is at the moment, but it's only 12:13. I've got another couple of minutes. But I'll tell you what it reminds me of. A little bit. It reminds me of when people used to get very worked up for reasons that, unfortunately, I kind of once agreed with. They used to get very worked up about sports days trying to recognise every child in the schools. Sports days being recalibrated to stop making most kids feel awful. Because if you found yourself being picked last, or you were running around, or even if you ran your absolute heart out and you never did better than 5th, sports days were always sort of designed to give all of the glory to the same 3 or 4 kids year after year after year after year. And at primary level and early secondary, it seems to me much healthier to try and encourage a love of sport without confining it to the people who were brilliant. I wish I'd done more sports at school. I stopped doing it, partly because I was a rebel without a cause and rugby at my school was a religion, but also partly because I was never going to be the best. I wasn't bad. I know you might find that hard to believe, but I wasn't the best. And in that kind of elitist environment, if you weren't the best, there were other things I could be the best at, like public speaking or acting, things where I would win the prizes, but I was never going to be the best at rugby. I was in the same year at school as Lawrence Delalio, who went on to captain England. So, that's a fairly conclusive piece of evidence that I was never going to be the best. And Easterby brothers, who played for Ireland, one of whom is now the younger one, Simon, I think, is the defence coach of the Irish rugby team. So there was some amazing world-class embryonic rugby players at my school, and so I kind of half gave it up, and I wish I hadn't, because I lost out on so much. And part of the reason why I think less gifted people give it up is partly because we create a culture that says if it's not gold, it doesn't matter. If it's not gold, it's old. There's a big but coming. I like big buts, I cannot lie. But if you don't put all the focus on gold, if you don't do this way round, if you don't essentially not dismiss necessarily, I think sometimes the dismissal is performative. It's just a sort of little bit of childish provocation, deliberately trying to wind people up by saying that silver and bronze medals don't matter. But there is a culture, there is a cultural sense that the gulf between gold and bronze is much more than 2 spots. The gulf between gold and silver is much more than a nanosecond. It is somehow culturally much more impressive to win gold. I'm not interested in silver. You've seen athletes say it. I think Daley Thompson on a recent brilliant documentary might have said something like that. And I don't know. I'm going to say something now that I don't think is going to come as a major shock to you. Are you ready? I am not, and never will be, an elite sportsman. But if I was, would a culture that essentially glorifies silver and bronze more than we currently do, would that somehow make me less likely to win gold? Do you understand what I'm saying? Is there something in the notion that by really ramming home the notion, the idea that gold, it's all about gold, you actually increase the likelihood of winning it? But as I say, I'm not an elite sportsman, so I may need a little bit of guidance on this. So there's two things going on here. Yeah, I think you're right. Jose Mourinho threw away a runners-up medal, but team sports tournaments with cups at the end, that's different. That's very, very different. For a start, it's one against one, team against team. I think athletics is different. I was more excited about Georgia Bell's bronze than I was about anybody's gold, right? And I think that is partly because of the tenuous personal connection, but it's also because I knew the story. The story was extraordinary. So the other educational parallel I'll draw, and I want you to think about this because I think this is a bit of a kicker. Who deserves more applause? The straight A student who just got another A, or the straight F student who just got their first ever B? Who deserves more applause? Who deserves more applaud? Who has worked harder? Whose teacher has worked the biggest miracle? The teacher of the straight A student who just got another A, or the teacher of the straight F student, a straight D student who just got their first ever B? So there's something going on here that I think runs a lot deeper than mere athletics. And obviously, I think that the fact Great Britain got the third highest total number of medals at the Paris Olympics in 2024 should involve a hell of a lot more praise and plaudits than it has managed to achieve so far. It's 18 minutes after 12. The number you need is 0345 6060973 is the number you need both for WhatsApp and to call in. And God, everyone's listening today. Charlie's just texted in to say, by the way, I'm the producer of the Daley Thompson documentary that James has just mentioned. And Cam's been in touch to say, James, would you be happy becoming the third best radio presenter in the world? Well, the truth is, Cam, I could probably live with the relegation, but I think it would smart a bit. It's 12:19. So Ben says, can we all try and guess which Olympic sport you'd be best at, James? I'm going for trampolining, which reminded me of some research that YouGov did, and it looks at how many Britons reckon they could qualify for the 2028 Olympics if they started training today. So if you haven't seen this story, what percentage of Britons reckon they could qualify for the 2028 Olympics if they started training today? All right, just text me that one, 84850, or WhatsApp it to 0345 6060973. Because when you look at the sports as well, I'm going to tease you with these as well. What sport do you think came first? The one that people think, if I really put my shoulder to the wheel for the next 4 years, I could be in Los Angeles in 2028. It's the table tennis. Have you seen the table tennis at the Olympics, you absolute melons? It's like super powered. They do things with the bat and the ball that looks like origami. The idea that if you put in 4 years of hard graft at ping pong, you could go to... Anyway... No one will be surprised to learn that the percentage of men who think they could qualify for the next Olympics is higher than the percentage of women. So have a guess at that, and then have a guess at what sports you think are much higher up than other sports. And yes, I also found the Australian breakdancer Rachel Gunn magnificent in all sorts of ways. And that's another story that actually has a lot more going on than you might otherwise realise. My friend Pete Fitzsimmons, who used to play rugby for Australia and now a brilliant writer, writes some fantastic history books, but he's written a great article about Ray Gunn, as she's called, that I heartily recommend as well. But the question of gold and whether or not, if you took away slightly from the idea that gold is everything and that silver is losing, you would actually make your athletes, your players, less likely to win gold, or whether, as I suggest, getting the third highest total number of medals is a more important achievement than the total number of gold medals. The more I think about that, the more I think it's true. But I'm often wrong, as you know. Jack's in Hackney. Jack, what would you like to say?
Hey, James. Thanks for having me.
Hello, Jack. Hey, you're welcome. What's on your mind?
I think that with our kind of really modern look at the Olympics, how it's televised, we've got it in HD, we get great documentaries and follow-up pieces and all that type of stuff. I think as people now, we can appreciate how close some bronzes can be to a gold. And I think that it naturally kind of makes you say, yeah, like that guy won the gold, but he won it by 0.000 of a second. So,
which you wouldn't back in the day. That probably would have been a dead heat, wouldn't it? Because the technology wouldn't have existed to put a cigarette paper between the two of them.
Exactly. Let alone the developments in sports science and exercise sciences, nutrition, health, even engineering with regards to equipment is
and shoes as well.
Yep. I mean,
and when you say equipment, you're not referring to that pole vaulter who knocked the bar off accidentally.
No, but
that was a story. So that means that you still. Okay, so how would we do it? Maybe 3 points for a gold, 2 for a silver, 1 for a bronze. So actually, if you win 100 bronzes and only 30 golds, you come top of the medal table. I think that would be fair. I could live with that.
At the moment, I have to admit, I wouldn't advocate for a change to the table yet. I would put it definitely in consideration. But for me personally, the problem is that despite the fact that, I mean, look at the 100 meters, that was very, very, very closely decided. However, if you then go and to look at the flip side, you have the swimming, and that I think her name was Ledecky for the US. She won one race by such an unimaginable amount. I was like, how are you beating them by that much? In a sense, I still think that keeps the value in gold, and I do think that. No one's suggesting they should all get the same medal, but in terms of when you top them all up at the end of the games, it seems odd that you can have the third highest total and only come third. I don't know, maybe it's not odd to some people, and you're right, we could just leave it on the back burner and come. But the technology, the tiny margins adds to the idea that there's something going on here. If you spent the next 4 years training, what Olympic sport do you reckon you could qualify for the 2028 Olympics in? I'll tell you what, it's a little bit of a cheat, but in LA they're going to introduce flag football, and I used to play, so I think that I still keep in quite good shape. I would have to give up pretty much a lot of things that make me happy, but I reckon I'd have a shot. I'd have a shot.
You heard it here first. Go get him, Jack. Go get him. It's 27 after 12. Thank you, mate. Harry's in Richmond. Harry, what would you like to say?
Hi. So I think it's a lot bigger a deal of just getting to the Olympics than a lot of people think. And one thing that a lot of people don't recognise is 8th place in an Olympic final gets you sponsorships, it gets you prize monies, it gets you a lot of different things. Purely coming dead last in the final is a lot harder than a lot of people think. And that's just the last person.
Well, not on the day. Not on the day, Harry. On the day, it's really easy to come last. but to get into the race, because, I'm not bigging myself up. I would come last in the Olympic 100 metres final.
I've seen that. Actually.
But to get there is to be the 8th fastest in the world that year is an astonishing achievement, and it's slightly undervalued by all the gold fetishization that goes on, perhaps.
Yeah. So I saw your the study that not study, but the kind of questionnaire survey that was taken on. Yeah. I saw that survey, and 6% of Brits thought they could make the 100-metre final. So I'm a 400-metre sprinter. I train every morning at 5 a.m. so that I'm home before my kids wake up. Wow. And I spend maybe 16 to 20 hours a week on the track and in the gym. All sorts of things go on behind this, and I can tell you now, I started my 2028 Los Angeles Olympics journey back in 2012. Wow. I was never going to go to any of these Olympics. I would love to go to the Los Angeles Olympics, but I was never going to, because the sheer performance that you have to put out. So I've got friends who went to the Olympics. I've got friends who medaled at the Olympics as well. So for one, there's Samuel Reardon, who is a Bromley athlete competing in the 4x400, and he was part of the team that won bronze in the Olympic final for the mixed relay. And that is a very big achievement because
of course it is. It's a huge achievement. It's a mammoth achievement, and his backstory will add to the sense of achievement. Which the more you know about it, in your case, in my case with Georgia Bell, the more magical that bronze becomes. What's the dream for you then, Harry? What is it that you're striving towards with this training regime?
I mean, obviously, I would love to say that I can go to the Olympics. I mean, I've been dreaming of it since 2012, and I mean, it's what I get up every day to try and do. I've also become quite passionate about it, so it's not really something I think I'll ever give up. But I mean, it's just about being able to do something, because this is a feat. This is a real big feat.
That's a great word. It's a huge feat. Where are you? Where do you sit in the national rankings, if I'm not being too nosy?
Top 100, I think.
Yeah?
But
so that's why you're so offended. You're so offended by 6% of people who think they could be in the 100 metres.
Nobody knows. Unless you're on the journey, nobody will ever know. And for that, I wish them the best of luck. Just don't get your hopes up.
Don't get your hopes up. Don't buy your ticket yet, Harry. Take care, mate. I love this. Oddly, rugby sevens has got one of the lowest responses. Only 3% of people think they could be in the rugby sevens. Oddly, there'll be some people currently playing basketball or just very fast runners who've never played rugby in their life, who, if they did actually get taught rugby, could probably quite easily get into the rugby sevens. But no, he's absolutely right. 6% of people think that they could be in both the 100-metre sprint and the 100 metres breaststroke swimming. Have you seen the footage of what happens when someone like Michael Thorpe goes up against normal swimmers or even like good club swimmers? If you put Usain Bolt up against good club athletes, he's finished before they've even got upright. I love this. But what do you think comes top? I haven't given you the overall percentage yet, the number of Brits, the percentage of Brits who think they could easily, or not easily, they think they could qualify for the next Olympics if they started training today. And what do you think are the top 5 subjects? I'm telling you now, the 5th discipline that people think they could qualify for is even funnier than the 100-metre sprint optimists. It really is. I'll tell you a story, only from something I saw on the telly, about why that's so ridiculous, after Amelia Cox brings you the very latest headlines. It is 12:35. You're listening to James O'Brien on at LBC. Do you think it's a reflection of how little exercise we do these days? People think, I put in 4 years, I could be at the Olympics. So 27% of the population think they would definitely, probably, qualify for at least one of the sports listed, with 10-metre air rifle shooting coming out on top. And bizarrely, it's something I don't think I've ever actually told you. I did 10-metre air rifle shooting for about 6 or 7 years of my life, once a week, with competitions in between against other schools, and I was quite good at it. But that's 6 or 7 years of training, and I wasn't even the best in my own school, let alone the best in the country, so that I would qualify for the Olympics. 13% of the population think they could qualify for the archery, which I suppose you're thinking about eye-hand coordination, but oh dear, badminton, do me a favour, table tennis, absolute madness. And then the one that took my breath away, 7% of the population think that they would definitely, probably qualify for at least one sport listed. 7% think they'd qualify for the rowing. I misread that at first. I thought it said rowing. And then I thought, yeah, actually, mate, you probably could get yourself into the Olympic team if it was rowing. But it's not rowing, it's rowing. There's a documentary about, I wonder if the director's listening. There was a documentary about Steve Redgrave's generation of rowers, looking at the training regime. And Redgrave, I don't think I've misremembered this, every single day, at least once, he would, on the rowing machine, go as fast as he possibly could until his body just literally gave out, and he would fall off the machine vomiting, and he would push himself to that point every single day for pretty much his entire adult life. I remember watching that and thinking, I don't know if I could do that if my life depended on it. I don't know if I could actually, once my body's screaming out and the lactic acid is, and obviously if my life depended on it, I'd go a little bit further than I would normally, but to the point where You don't just slow down a little bit where your body just isn't responding to the message that your brain is sending it. But no matter, 7% of us think that we could probably get a seat in an Olympic boat if we just put our shoulder to the wheel for the next 4 years. I love this conversation, but how much kudos should we attach to gold versus silver and bronze? 0345 6060 973. Michael is in Bordeaux. Michael, what would you like to say?
I simply love your programme. I finished my training I can listen to it.
Excellent.
I'm a professional rowing coach.
Yes.
And I also coach Olympic-style archery. There you go. Now, don't row with me.
Good Lord. What an amazing double. Nice one.
Thank you. Worked hard at it.
Yes.
Anyway, a couple of points. First of all, gold recognition. Obviously, supreme. But I'm also Bermudian. We had a Bermudian sculler in the Olympics for a tiny, tiny little island.
Yes.
Actually, in the last Olympics, 50% of our athletes, 50% got gold for a tiny island. Beat that.
Well, I can't, can I? I don't think anybody can they?
We had 2 athletes, and and we got the women's triathlon gold.
Yes, of course.
Anyway, so he worked his tail off to even qualify for the qualifying rounds. So he had to travel the world trying to get this qualifying time, which he did. He actually rode for Cambridge as well. So just getting there is an absolute fantastic achievement. Getting gold, brilliant. Silver.
So how do we police this? So we're talking about Dara Alizadeh, I think.
We are the hairy beast,
and he's got the hair I had when I was in my 20s. Actually, I was wondering where it had gone. Actually, Michael, I'm glad to see it's been so well looked after. So this is so interesting, isn't it? Because I don't think that the audience and the coverage reflects the fact that for some people, a bronze will be a bigger achievement than a gold is for other people. If you've won 3 golds, when Usain Bolt wins another gold, it's magnificent and it's magical, and it's what the Olympics are partly about. But I don't think we put enough weight on the other thing that the Olympics is about, which is the journeys of athletes like Dara.
Yeah, inclusion. I mean, your analogy to a D student getting a B.
Yes, yes,
brilliant. They marginally they've come up a lot further. But coming back, if I could, to can you train for to get in the next Olympiad? The British squad, Olympic general squad, I don't even remember, but I think it was at the time of London Olympics, had searched for a giant. Sounds strange.
Yes.
But men had to be over 6'2", women had to be over 6 foot. And then with a very, very intense weekend of analysis, they either went into rowing or handball. I don't know anything about handball. And Mo Sabibi was a product of that.
That's how they found it. But they're looking, but they're looking for needles in haystacks, aren't they? They're looking for 1 in a million specimens.
Yeah, that apply. They have to jump ahead to.
Oh, phone line's going a bit funny. So you could find someone. There will be people in existence who could be at the Olympics having never played a sport before, or having done it at a very low level in the next 4 years. But of course, the idea that 27%, 30% of men, no less, could get there if they started training now is absolutely ridiculous. Thank you, Michael. The phone line went a bit south, but thank you so much for the kind words as well. And some of the other ones that are quite high up. So 6% think they could get into the 100-metre sprint or the cycling road race. I got on my normal bicycle the other day after riding a line bike for much of since spring, and I thought I was ill. I thought something had happened to my legs. It's just a line bike, which, if you don't know, if you're not in a town where they are on every street corner, it's got a little electric engine, so you're slightly propelled, or maybe more than slightly propelled, actually. It's particularly helpful on hills, but I hadn't realised how helpful it was on the flat. So I got on my normal bike to go and buy some cat food, since you asked. I thought there was something wrong with the bike. I'm going through all the gears. I'm going, what's wrong with it? I got off, had a look at it. There's something wrong with my bicycle. And I realised that it's just that my legs have got used to the pressure that you exert to pedal a line bike. And then when you get back on a bike that's not electronically aided, I felt like I was riding through treacle. But no, nevertheless, 6% of the population think that they could get into the road race in the cycling if they just put in 4 years of work. And 6% think they could do the shot put. And another one that you'll be very surprised to learn I have some experience of is the trampoline. There's a few Olympics ago, 2 or 3 Olympics ago, I went to train with an Olympic trampolinist. Kat Driscoll, her name was. She was lovely. And I nearly broke her arm, actually. She was trying to help me do a jump. And I held on to her hand for a little bit too long. I nearly broke it. So that would have been very But have you seen these people? You wouldn't be able to jump as high as they jump, even without doing any twirls and somersaults. You'd be too frightened. And you'd miss the trampoline. They go so high in the sky that even coming down in the right direction is an enormous gift, is an enormous skill. Who are these people who think they could qualify for the Olympics? I've no idea. Where are we going next? Andrew, I think, in Ulverston. Andrew, what would you like to say?
Just regarding kind of what sport I do, I think I wouldn't be any good at anything to do with the Olympics other than maybe the guy that sits at the end of the runway for the long jump who raises the flag. I don't think you get any medals
for that. You don't get any medals for that. But also, you can't look away. You've got to be on tip-top mental condition to do that.
Absolutely. Anyway, my point. I don't think there's anything wrong with focusing on gold.
Okay.
But I do think that there are effectively 2 types of silver and bronze. There's the silver that's won by the world champion favourite coming into the Olympics, and they're disappointed to get silver. And then there is the silver and bronzes, which are won by people who on paper, have absolutely no chance of winning anything.
Yes.
And they do it. And you can tell, I have no qualifications whatsoever to talk about this from a, sporting perspective, but you can tell.
Nor do I, mate. Nor do I, but we're doing all right.
I'm obviously clearly an expert in every Olympic sport. Having watched a lot of them over the last 2 weeks.
Same here. Especially speed climbing.
You can tell by the TV interviews afterwards how much a medal means to people, and you can tell those 2 different types. And we saw it a lot just with where we missed out on gold by fractions of seconds. But there are those 2 different types of medals, and
you're absolutely right. But I think there's 2 different types of spectator as well. There's the ones that understand what you've described and can take as much joy from the second sort of silver or bronze that you described as they do from the first sort of gold.
Yes, very much so. And it's those stories, as you say, it's those stories behind it that really make that difference.
And then there's the kind of spectator that can't, because they're misanthropic or whatever it may be. But I like that. Thank you, Andrew. Speed climbing. If I had my time again, I think I'd have had a crack at speed climbing as a kid. I'd have been rubbish at it, but it just looks so exciting. It's 12:45. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Mentioned the Imam in Liverpool who has been doing amazing work with his community. Well, not necessarily just with his community, but also with some of the people that were minded to attack his mosque, Adam Kelwick. And I mentioned today that when we started talking about the Olympics, a lot of people associated with the Olympics got in touch. Adam's rung in himself, and we'll find out a little bit more about what he's been up to after this. Hard to find any silver linings, really, in the context of last week's riots. No silver linings, of course, in the context of the events and the deliberately, in some cases, fermented misinformation that followed the original tragedy. But if you look hard enough, there are silver linings, and perhaps one of the biggest was discovered in Liverpool, where the Imam of what I think is the oldest mosque in the country took it upon himself not just to interact with, but to positively reach out to some of the far-right sympathising demonstrators who'd congregated outside his own mosque. I mentioned Adam Kelwick a little earlier in the programme, and I think one of his mates must have got on the phone and told him we were talking about him, because Adam has now rung in and joins me on the line now. Thank you, Adam. Why did you do it? Where did the idea... I know you work with the Light Foundation, which I know a little bit about, which is a much longer-term project designed to build bridges bridges between communities and to try to diffuse suspicion and negativity. But in the context of a mob potentially convening on the steps of your own mosque, where did the precise moment come from that you thought, you know what, I'm going to go out there. I'm not just going to go out there, I'm going to take them some scran.
Yeah, so as you rightly mentioned, it's the oldest mosque in the country. It was founded in Victorian times by an amazingly interesting gentleman called Sheikh Abdullah William Henry Quilliam. And we also have a story where back in Victorian times, 120 years ago, a violent mob gathered outside the same mosque and they threw stones at the windows and they smashed some of the windows. His response the day after, and just for a bit of context, the first Muslim community in the whole of the UK were this bunch of white Scouse Muslims. And so the next day...
Adam, we're losing the phone line a bit. Hopefully it won't go down again, but I got as far as white Scouse. The first Muslim community in the UK was a bunch of white Scouse what?
That's right. They were white Scouse Muslims, and their leader opened the doors to the people who were protesting, fed people food, and invited them in for discussion, basically. And amazing things happened. That community was very vibrant. They were all about serving society. They ran an orphanage. They ran a women's refuge, printing presses, free education, which in Victorian times it wasn't. It wasn't widely available for people back then, and it was such a vibrant community. And we decided to take a page out of their book. What I was saying to my people as well, because many people within the Muslim community were skeptical of this. They were saying to me things like, "No, you can't speak to these people. They don't understand. They're full of hatred." And what I was saying to them is, they're attacking us for being Muslim. They're attacking us for following the Quran. They're attacking us for taking the Prophet Muhammad as a leader and an example. So why don't we do that? And I kind of spoke to them from an Islamic perspective. The Quran.
What's the first thing you say, Adam? What's the very first thing you say? I've seen some of the photographs. Some very powerful footage of you hugging and shaking hands and breaking bread. And I've seen the ITV News interview that you did in conjunction with one of the men that you've reached out to. But when you come out of the mosque and you walk towards the threat, what's the first thing you say to them in order to try and break down these barriers?
Yeah, so before I spoke words, I'd like to think my body language and my vibes were kind of inviting. So I smiled and I really went over there with a genuine intention, because I've always taught that every single human on the planet has potential good in them. They have this goodness in their hearts. For some people, it's like when you put sugar in a cup of tea and it settles at the bottom. Everybody has this sweetness in their hearts, and sometimes it just needs a bit of a stir. So I went over, I smiled, I tried to make myself look as least threatening as possible, even though I am a 6 foot tall and quite broad guy. And the first thing I said was, "Would you like some food?" And the first people I actually spoke to just looked straight through me as if I didn't exist. And I moved on to the next people, and they gave me a firm nod as to say, "No, we don't want any." And then finally we broke through to somebody who accepted the offer of a burger. And from then on, it was just giving out food, speaking, listening, shaking hands, exchanging details. And I promised them that we would invite them back into the mosque soon. And we did that on Saturday. And some of the people who protested actually came along to the event, which we titled, "Is Islam a Threat to Britain?" They came, they listened, they asked some pretty tough questions, and we gave them some honest answers. And one gentleman in particular, he was at the protest just the week before. He said, "I'm different now." He said, "I've learnt a lot tonight."
What sort of questions did they ask you?
In the schoolyard, where dreams take flight, we found love in the morning light. Hand in hand, we walk the halls, innocent hearts, heedless of all falls. Giggles and blushes under the old oak tree. In the innocence of youth, we felt so free. Innocent love, pure and true, like the morning dew shining passing notes in class.
So at the event, they were asking about Sharia law and is it compatible with the UK? They were asking about why the Prophet Muhammad married so many wives and why does Islam allow marriage to cousins? They were asking, a whole range of questions, and we welcomed the questions and we spoke to them. And as I said, we promised them honest answers, and we had this really good discussion. But what I think is, what was more important than the content of the questions and the answers was the actual interaction itself, where they saw us as human beings like themselves, and we saw them as human beings like ourselves. And I think the real magic actually happened after the question and answer session, when we broke up for food and regular people from our community were speaking to regular people from their community, and amazing relationships were built. And that was further reinforced yesterday when we were invited on a family day trip to Wales by one person who was seen to be a kind of ringleader for gathering people at the Save Our Children demonstration on the Saturday, which turned into riots and violence. He actually reached out to me. I've been speaking to these people all week. I've been speaking to one of Tommy Robinson's right-hand men here in Liverpool. We sat down, we had a 90-minute discussion. We didn't agree on everything, but what we did realize is this right now feels like people are trying to turn us against each other. And I'm glad. So in the Scouse circles in Liverpool, from the north to the south, a lot of people who've been dragged into this narrative kind of realized that they've been duped, and a firm message is coming out. And it came out from the valleys of North Wales yesterday, when me and the Muslim group stopped to pray in one of the valleys, and it felt so safe, because these people who just last week were protesting side by side with right-wing fascists, when now we felt safe, we felt confident that they were there. If anybody did wish any harm upon us, they were there to defend us and protect us. And so these amazing relationships have been built.
So humanizing through demystifying, really.
Yeah, that's what it's about.
How do you keep...
This is what I've been telling my congregation as well. I've been telling them, don't brush them all with the same brush. And I'm sure you know this as well, James, because you speak to a lot of people in this situation. Sure. The vast majority of the people who were amongst their ranks protesting, I believe, were genuine people with genuine concerns. They've just been dragged into this narrative. And I just received a message within the last hour or two. And I'll just share some of this. So this was somebody who was at the Save Our Children protest. He's reached out to me. He sent me a message saying he'd like to meet up with me. And he said, I also see this as an opportunity to admit where I was wrong. Not everybody in that crowd last Saturday held ill intentions. And if we want those people to learn where they've been misinformed, then I have to admit my mistake as well as allow them that space. So this is it. People are coming together. And Liverpool is the place that this happens.
you can't resist it, can you? At the end, but you're right. Liverpool does have a history of resisting fascism in particular, which is why some of my callers last week were from Liverpool were particularly emotional about the fact that things appeared to have gone backwards on streets where once fascism would have been resisted with every sinew. I hope we can talk again, Adam. I'd love to find out more about what you're doing, and I want to stress as I say goodbye that not only were you doing this before the recent flare-ups, but you're clearly committed to continuing doing it long after.
That's right. People are saying we just want things to go back to how they were before the riots. I'm saying no. We've entered into a new phase now. Alliances have been built, friendships have been made, and we're not going to allow people to do this to us again.
I like that, and yes, exactly, because it's about Tinder, isn't it? And but thank you, Adam Kelwick, the imam of the oldest mosque in the country there, as you heard, the Abdullah Quilliam Society Mosque up in Liverpool, the oldest in England, and the person he was referring to as having had a genuine light bulb moment, a chap called Mark. You can see that on the ITV News website, and a lot of you getting in touch with me to tell you how moved you are by what Adam had to say, and indeed what he has done and what he was talking about. I'd urge you to have a little look at that as well. It went up on Friday of last week, and contains similarly uplifting and inspirational words and experiences, descriptions. I'm out of time, I think. Ryan in Liverpool, my apologies. You were going to talk about Katarina Johnson-Thompson, which is a wonderful example, actually, of a silver that was worth... I can't believe we got all the way to 12.59 and I haven't actually realised what the cliche that has been hanging in front of me for the entire hour of this conversation about whether we put more... too much emphasis on gold medals when other achievements in silver and bronze, and even as Richard Harry in Richmond reminded us, sometimes coming 8th, getting to the Olympic final at all is an extraordinary achievement. Can a silver medal, I should have said, ever be worth more than its weight in gold? But that might have been a little bit too icky. That's it from me for another day. We will do it all again tomorrow morning from 10. If you're coming to my event in Edinburgh, I'll see you in half an hour, would you believe? But if you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you'll also find all of LBC's shows to catch up on, as well as all of Global's live radio stations. So do download Global Player. It's free. Get it from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick with you at 4 on LBC, but now sitting in for Sheila Fogarty, it's Matthew Wright. 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 It's Matthew